All right, we are live on YouTube. So Michelle, whenever you're ready to start the meeting, at the top you have a practice mode only orange button.
Yes.
So when you are ready, hit broadcast, and then they'll open up to the public. I don't know if you want to do that.
Okay, I'll wait
early.
until I'll wait, Mayor, right before you're ready to call the meeting, let me know, and then I'll hit that button, and then you can go ahead.
I will be muted for the remainder of the meeting unless specifically called upon.
All right, thank you.
So it seems like whenever you guys hit share screen, my computer jumps to the desktop.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not good.
Can you try to hit share screen one more time? I had to relaunch. I want to see.
I can do it.
Okay. Yeah, it kicked. Can you guys still hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you.
See you.
Yeah, it kicks me out and takes me back to the desktop every time you hit share screen.
No
We can
kidding.
still see you, Kelly.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
But you
I
can't see the
you.
PowerPoint.
Is Zoom down at the bottom when that happens? Down in your taskbar? It's a little blue and white camera icon.
Okay. I don't see it anywhere.
Mayor.
Yeah, I don't have an icon. I was launching it through the email you sent me, Jake.
Okay.
Michelle, do you hear me now?
I can hear you now. So I have 6 o'clock. So are we going to take a minute to see if Jake can fix Kelly, or are we just going to go forward?
I'll give him a minute.
Yeah.
Where's Andrew's
Kelly,
not here yet?
Kelly, if you want to go to the city's YouTube and you can mute the live stream and watch it. That way, in case you lose it, you still can watch the live stream. I would just mute it so you don't have any feedback issues with hearing duplicate audio.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and send you the email with the link real quick.
Okay.
Is Councilman Felder, are you on? I don't hear him.
He's not on the list.
He's not on the list.
I don't see him either.
I don't have his number or anything to contact him.
Councilman Felder, are you on?
Whenever you guys hit share screen, my computer jumps to the desktop.
So Kelly, at the bottom of that YouTube video, just mute it. That way we're not.
Yeah, I just did.
All right.
Okay, so am I just watching and communicating through here, but you guys can see and hear me through the Zoom?
We can hear you.
Yep, we're seeing you just fine.
Okay.
Are you ready, Mayor?
It looks like, John, are you trying to get Andrew?
Yeah, I'm trying to call him right now. I'm not getting through though. It's just ringing.
All right.
I just texted him, and I haven't heard back either. So.
Okay.
It's possible
You
he's
get online for the budget meeting.
What's that?
see what John says.
Just a reminder, we're live on YouTube.
Thank you.
Okay, well, keep going then. I'll let him know. Thanks. Now he's trying to get on through an iPad.
He might need to. We might need to promote him once we hit broadcast if he's stuck as an attendee.
Okay.
So when we're ready, just go ahead, hit broadcast. I'll watch attendees and see if I see him.
I
All
guess
right, thank you.
Yes,
Thank
we're
you,
ready.
Jake. All right, I'm gonna click broadcast, Mayor, and then you're on.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good evening for the Monroe City Council special meeting. Please, clerk, call the roll.
Councilperson Germaini,
Here.
Lamore,
Here,
Felder,
He is catching up with us.
Whitman,
Here.
Michaelangeli,
Present.
Vining,
Here.
Mayor Clark.
Here, we have first item, clerk.
So the first item is the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay.
So just asking that we all gather our thoughts this evening and find a moment of quiet before we begin the important deliberations that we have before us for the good of the city of Monroe and all of its residents.
Thank you. I see a screen for Councilman Felder. I see has popped up, so I believe there he is. He's with us. So at this point, please join in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America and to the republic for which it
Stands
one
one
nation,
nation,
under God,
God,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty.
liberty
and justice for all.
Thank you. Clerk, next item, please.
Next item is review of proposed fiscal year 2020-2021 budget, millage and utility rates.
Thank you. Before I go to the city manager, Mr. Pastu, Councilman Felder, I see you've connected. You're with us. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm on a device that I've not used previously, so I apologize for the delay.
No delay. I appreciate the efforts in getting through. Just a quick minute, as we do on the rules of the chamber here, because in the event we, for ourselves, but also those that may be joining us, be mindful of the time, as if there's those that in the public comment time at the end of the meeting wish to speak, we'd ask you to address, state who you are. 3 minutes is the time frame we have with the rules of the chamber, and make sure that we get through all of our agenda as well. Obviously, we're back with our virtual meeting, and in the event that one of the council members drops off, we will pause for a short time frame. Obviously, we have a long presentation with the budget, and I know that was presented to the council ahead of time, so there's opportunities, even if we drop off, we can catch up, and maybe some questions you have as we get to the conclusion of that. Councilman Michaelangeli, also, if I drop off, I'd ask that you chair the meeting to continue, and then we can see how we get back together.
Understood.
Very good. So with that, Mr. Pastu, our first item is the reviewing the proposed fiscal year budget 2021. If you would please do the introductions for us.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think Mr. Sell is going to load the PowerPoint presentation for tonight.
Yeah, Jake, if you're listening, Barry Leroy needs to be promoted to a panelist. And I will get the PowerPoint started right now.
I've promoted Barry.
Thanks. Let me share my screen here. And you all should be seeing a full screen view. If I can get it to work. Yeah, full screen view of the budget presentation at this point.
Well, Mayor, City Council, thanks for having this special meeting tonight. Certainly, there are numerous challenges associated with this budget, and certainly a great deal of uncertainty, which is, I think, the importance of going through this tonight. As I indicated in correspondence last week, I was very uncomfortable given the uncertainty of the budget and asking you to adopt a budget next Monday night without going through it and having some context of really where the challenges are. So again, I appreciate that. We'll go through it in a very similar manner, but clearly we have to highlight where that uncertainty is. And that's the one thing if there's going to be a continual theme through it, there is some uncertainty associated with this. And, and as I indicated before, I'll beg your indulgence as we get more information regarding the effect of the pandemic on the economics and finances of the city, that we are going to have to make some amendments. So, Ed?
Here we go.
So as in the past, we've got an outline. I'll handle the first couple items, the general overview. Ed goes through a lot of the detail, and then on the back end of, we'll have Barry Leroy go through the water and wastewater utility budgets, and then certainly offer some final comments and discussions, but certainly, as is the case, I think it's be fine to interject during the presentation. There will be a couple of points where I would expect you to jump in and ask questions. And I think the capability of raising your hand to let the mayor know would probably be of help. So thanks. Just in a general overview, we've got, really three major items in there. And then the last two is, just to continue with some of the aspects of prior budget objectives. And so, the DTE taxable value currently in the process of finalizing the settlement agreement, and we'll go through and talk about the magnitude of it and the fact that given the magnitude of the settlement and the reduction in the taxable value, Mr. Selp put together a 5-year forecast, which I think is critical for review of the proposed budget that we have this year. As alluded to before, the pandemic is going to have phenomenal effect on our budget. The mayor had sent me a webinar he was in part of yesterday with SEMCOG with 3 economists from the University of Michigan. A very, very, very bleak forecast for the immediate year. They're anticipating within a couple of years, maybe things will start to fall back toward normal, but clearly this first year, the budget year that we're going to be entering July 1st is going to be very, very dismal as it pertains to state revenue sharing. I did put some council goals and objectives in there. They're in draft form. We have not had a chance to finalize and discuss those, and some of them will probably be amended a bit in light of the pandemic that we're currently facing. But also I wanted to let you know that the budget was structured with a couple of the items in there, and certainly some flexibility in addressing items that were part of that goals and objectives. We do want to continue the economic development opportunities that we've been pursuing going forward in some ways, given the taxable value challenges. It's probably more pertinent than ever. And then last, the customer experience technology initiatives. I think in light of what's happened with, with our pandemic and clearly us using technology with this meeting tonight, there are more applications that we need to pursue and probably a lot more aggressively in servicing our customers. So from a DTE taxable value challenge is clearly when we put this budget together, mostly with information that we had in early March, this was clearly the most significant challenge that we had from a long-term perspective. As talked about before, 48% of our tax base is the DTE plant. It'll diminish with time over the next 5 years. Last year, 8.8 million in taxes and fees came from that plant alone. Over the next 5 years, we're looking at a 30% reduction in taxable value, which translates to a operating reduction of about $2.2 million. That doesn't take into account, what we would have received in the past for a consumer price index increase. Again, we've talked about the long-term issue, the plant decommissioning or repurposing over the next 20 years, that we have to continue to keep that in mind and simultaneously address the infrastructure deficiencies that we have talked about in the past, forcing us to continually evaluate operational and efficiencies and financial sustainability, which was, I think, recognized in the goals and objectives. And then obviously the general fund, the greatest impact is on public safety, the police, fire, EMS service that's provided. The one thing that we will talk about is related to that is the contingency line item that was established with last fiscal year 18-19 budget. We set aside 1.5 million. Mr. Sell's projecting that we'll have about 2.35 million available through fiscal year 21-22. The other thing with it is we certainly want to seek some organizational and operation stability. And again, as I mentioned before, maintain our current economic development momentum. And again, ideally to allow time to develop and initiate a public safety short-term and long-term staffing plan. The state revenue sharing, the effects that we know that are going to happen related to the pandemic is going to be mostly related to state revenue sharing. We are getting the tax bills out for July 1st, or they'll be issued here in May for this upcoming fiscal year. Those amounts are set and established as far as the taxable value. But the presentation from the economist from Michigan, University of Michigan, painted a very, very bleak projection of the state. I've read that this current year that they're in, the state's fiscal year ends September 30th, they're looking at between a $1 and $3 billion shortfall. The following year, followed by a $1 to $4 billion shortfall. Basically, the message from one of the economists was you can plan on there being substantial reductions in your state revenue sharing. The numbers were pretty appalling I say appalling, striking in the sense of how economic activity in the form of sales tax, which generates a lot of the state revenue sharing, as well as income tax proceeds have diminished immensely. You look at the state transportation or Act 51 revenues, again, the amount of revenues coming in because people are not traveling as a result of the stay home, stay safe policy has really had a phenomenal impact on the funds that would be available. We're slightly under $6 million in the proposed budget. I think it's 5.8 when you look at our state revenue sharing. I'll tell you anywhere from probably 1.5 to $3 million is what we're going to probably be dealing with next year. That's, 25 to 50% reduction in the revenue from the state. So I keep that in mind because that is going to be a pretty significant challenge for us to come through. The good news, if there is any good news in it, that we start with at least 2.3 roughly, or at least not quite that much the first year, but it is going to be a challenge. Investment earnings are down. Again, the interest rates are phenomenally low. We have concerns with property tax growth. And then even today when Mr. Sell and Mr. Leroy and I were going through our presentation, Mr. Leroy was talking about some of the really significant drops with some of the large commercial customers with their water usage. So we can anticipate there may be some impact on that revenue stream as well. I'm not going to go through too many of, I've got them all listed, but with the goals and objectives, and it's clearly a draft based on our meeting in early February. I'll go through a couple of them quickly with you. On to the next one, Ed. One of the goals focuses on community development initiative. Again, one of the things that we talked about are listed certainly in the first phase of it. But the other one is affordable housing programs and policies. I know Council Member Iko Angeli talked with me a little bit about that after the budget was submitted. We had some funding put in for the Winchester corridor study, and he thought, maybe if we would put something more in affordable housing. So there is when I talked about some flexibility, we have some of that contained in the proposed budget. Economic development, clearly we're doing the 5-year forecast. And then again, listing some of the projects that we have ongoing that we feel are important to continue. Clearly working with our neighbors, in particular with Monroe Township, and again, working with the DDA to focus on redevelopment efforts. And it may have a little different function now as well, given the pandemic challenges with small businesses downtown. Again, optimizing information technology. Ed'll talk a little bit about a transition with the GIS later on. But clearly, I think more and more we're we have to continue to be more aggressive in using some of the capabilities of technology in servicing customers. Organizational development, we talked about succession plan, review of existing staffing positions that we have out there, and then also just review compensation and benefits for non-union staff was identified in their session in February.
Hey, Vince.
Yeah.
I see that Councilman Michelangelo has a question, so maybe we can stay with that. Otherwise, we'll have to go back to slides.
Okay, not a problem.
Councilman?
Thanks, Mayor. The question I had for the city manager was, these are draft goals. Are we going to have an opportunity to discuss them in more detail?
Absolutely. That's the intent. Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Very good. Vince?
Good. And so the organizational development piece, again, going through that. The next one was improve employee service and accountability. Public safety, first and foremost, I think, is going to be one of the things that we have to focus as soon as possible. I did put, well, I didn't put, but Mr. Richards and the students identified establishing joint management committee to instill organizational alignment, maybe misspelling alignment, I think. That doesn't look right, but at any rate, I will tell you that just a couple of comments I received related to the proposed budget having almost $180,000 in the public safety director position as recommended by the consultant. A little pushback on some of that, but I do think that, and we can talk a little bit later on about that position. But clearly, if we don't go that route, we do have to have some bridge, if you will, for not only with labor management, but even council as well to get this in alignment if we don't end up going forth with hiring a public safety director, regardless of which alternative we go for. So the second, if you just go back one there, Ed, and you'll see it in a couple of other places, negotiate sustainable collective bargaining agreements. I will clearly tell you on Sunday, March 8th, I was putting together proposals for a response for proposals related to COMIA, one bargaining unit. And by the end of the week, when we actually ended up closing city facilities, I'm in a much different place from where I was even in early March. And so I say that is that we will have to have some discussions related to the collective bargaining agreements. We don't have any scheduled now till late May. It's kind of just wait and see where things are at. And Ms. Howard has been making those arrangements with all 6 collective bargaining agreements, or unions, I should say. Next. And then just onto the next one as well. And then we have it enhance our existing communications that were discussed during the February session that we had with Eastern Michigan as well. So I know I'm going through that real quick. We will have time to probably through a work session to talk a little bit more about those and actually get them adopted. So before I turn it over to Ed, and Ed's going to take care of it from there, in a general sense, and I'm kind of going back at it backwards, but just to give you the framework in which the budget was developed, we started looking at the impact with DTE, and from that standpoint, in his 5-year forecast, we're okay for the first 3 years, and then years 4 and 5, things start finding their way into an operating deficit that is no longer sustainable. And part of that assumption, one of the major ones, was implementing a Medicare Advantage program for our retirees on their health care over the age of 65, bringing about some savings. But very consistent with what we talked about during our assessment with Fitch and Associates, that the first 3 years were okay, but we got to start moving this in a direction. Well, in light of the pandemic, it really has changed a lot of things. And so I think in some ways we have to keep in mind that we got to get through the first couple years as a result of it, because the economists do think that this will find its way back to some normality in 2022. But at the same time, we still have this other long-term challenge that we have to not lose sight of. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed unless there's any comments from council at this point.
I'll see if any questions from council on a review. I clearly, as city manager stated and Councilman Michelangelo, we're going to have opportunities to refine these as we go forward. But in a general sense, if there's any questions from Mr. Pastuan at this point, if not, we'll go to Mr. Sell. I don't see any hand raised. All right, Mr. Sell.
My screen says John Michelangelo has his hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Councilman Michelangelo.
Thanks, Mayor. A question for Vince and for Ed. I was reading one of the news feeds regarding that there's going to be a stimulus allocation back to the states, and Michigan was forecasted to get 3.8 billion. And then out of that, the state was going to end up with 2.3 billion, and the local units were going to be, you know, they were looking at 1.5 billion back to the local units relative to compensate for their costs. Did the economists talk about the federal stimulus coming to the state to help out with their budget issues?
In a very general, non-specific manner, they did talk about, yes, local governments are going, and state governments are going to be significantly impacted, obviously, as a result of this, but the details were not there as to what that allocation might look like.
Okay, so that has not been factored into the.
They have
any of our
not,
budget.
and I think that's, but it's a good point to keep driving home that there is going to be a lot of changes and a lot more information coming, and so we're going to be, you know, have to be pretty flexible as that takes place, because if we do get some money, that will affect, you know, some decisions that we're going to be able to make. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Councilman, also I follow up at the end of that presentation. The one analyst said he thought there'd be this fourth stimulus opportunity for the locals. Just before tonight's meeting, I saw, maybe I don't know if everybody got it, if not, I'll forward. There was an MML message that came out along those lines as well, and to voice our position with our congressmen and women about that. So I think it's definitely being discussed, but it wasn't figured at that point even from them. But appreciate the question. I'll look for other hands up. Oh, Councilman. No. Okay, I think we're good. Vince, if I guess we're going to Mr. Sell to do the financial overview and the highlights.
Yeah, I'll get started here and I'll go through a number of slides, talk about financial overview. We'll go through the general fund revenue and expenditures at a high level, talk about some of the major other funds that the city has, and then at that point I'll be turning it over to Barry Leroy to talk about the water and wastewater funds. So as Vince mentioned, all of these budget numbers were really done pre-pandemic, and future budget amendments are very likely, definitely in the area of state revenue sharing and our road funding in terms of the Michigan Transportation Fund. Those are probably the biggest state areas where we'll have to look at possible amendments. We'll talk about where we're at with fund balance, so that's a good thing, that we are very strong in fund balance, and that will be able to help us through this if we need to lean on it. As far as property tax revenue in general, what I did is I took the taxable value that was reported by the assessor's office for this year, and they did include what was the planned settlement is for DTE in that amount for what they gave for me for this year. But going forward into the future, I basically took everything but that and assumed a 2% increase, and then put in the DTE amounts that we've settled on from there. So that's how property tax revenue is budgeted in all the funds at this point. Fund balance for all of the funds are really adequate at this point, and we do have the funds budgeted for future budget stabilization. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The pension and retiree healthcare funds are adequately funded, and we'll talk a little more about that. There is a new fund in the budget this year because we added a corridor improvement authority. There's a new fund. you know, we don't really even know what it's going to capture as far as taxes next year. So we just kind of put a placeholder in there of $20,000. It's nothing, it's really a guess, but we did have to put a budget in there. So that one can be amended as we get more details on the specifics of what the financing will be. Barry's going to talk about the water and wastewater rates at the end. There are some increases to those, but if you were looking at what was projected last year, they're less than what was projected last year. And then we also have at the end of the ordinance, the airport hangar rental rates are recommended for approval, mainly about $25 per month. They haven't been increased in about 5 years, and it's just time to increase them. Some of the future concerns, obviously, we're going to be dealing with the ET taxable value reductions even with the COVID-19 virus. Are we looking at a recession or worse? Pension assumption changes will continue. That we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into some of the details. I think Vince talked about revenue sharing, federal budget reductions. I mean, CDBG is always a target, so we don't know where we're at with that. Right now, we get about $400,000 a year, so we'll see where that goes. We'll talk when we get to the major and local street funds, primarily the local street fund, where we're not having really enough funding to meet our plans that we'd like to. But some other areas are parks and facilities. And there's always funding needed for property acquisition and demolitions. We'll talk about what's in the budget for that, and then we'll look at the parking fund and airport fund. The parking fund just because concerned because of the fee reduction. The airport fund is mainly the general fund's having to subsidize that now. So we'll look at some of the personnel costs. Health insurance, which is our medical and prescription costs. If everybody's familiar with Public Act 152, it basically capped what governments could spend on health insurance. And so we are compliant with that act. And really what it allows us to do is spend at certain levels that the state gives us for premium rates. And so we're under those levels at this point, although we were getting close to them this last year. And those rates that the state give us only go up by the medical CPI every year. So that's usually 4% or less. And so that's what we budgeted in terms of our premium increases is 4% over what we're currently paying. And we also have a dental plan, and those are projected to go up 3%. Post-retirement health care, the actuary calculated our actuarial determined contribution, formerly ARC, at $823,816 this coming fiscal year. We currently have budgeted $694,894. A couple things go into that. We do get some Medicare Part D reimbursements that go towards that contribution, so we're estimating that'll be about $120,000 this year. And so those two go together to make up that contribution. But in future years, we're planning to recommend that the council approve implementing a Medicare Advantage plan for our over 65 retirees. And we've had that analyzed by the actuary as if those rates had been in place as of our last actuarial study. And if they had been in place, we would have been over 100% funded. I don't recall the exact amount. It seems like it was over 105%. And we wouldn't have a contribution at that point. So for that reason, in fiscal years 21-22 forward, we've zeroed out the retiree health care contribution for the general fund. The OPEB bond payment, though, we would still be making that. We'd still be paying about $2.32 million per year. That's citywide. That's not just the general fund. I think the general fund is about 1.6, 1.7 million of that. The last actuarial valuation was completed as of 12/31/18. We'll do another one as of 12/31/20. The estimated annual claims at that point were about 4.6 million, and we were 92.4% funded, which was an increase of about 8%. The total liability was about 65 million, which was down about $2.5 million. The pension contribution this coming year is going to be 2.13 million. That's what was calculated by the systems actuary. That is the contribution amount, assuming that we advance pay the amount basically on July 1st of each year. That allows us to drop that contribution by around $80,000 $80,000 to $90,000 is the number. Last year we were at $1.936 million doing that. The general fund portion of that is $1.74 million. The plan as a whole is about 90% funded. It's actually down a little bit, but we're going to keep the plan when it does its actuarial studies assumes an investment rate of return every year. In the past, it had always been at 7.5%, and we've been reducing that by 5 basis points every year. I believe this last plan was at 7.35%, and next year it'll go down to another 5 basis points to 7.3 until we get down to 7.25. So that's the biggest portion of why, you know, the contributions keep going up. As far as staffing levels, we're recommending a total staffing of 184.22 FTEs. You get a lot of part-time positions that get you up to that 0.22 position, like cadets in the police department, and are one of the big ones that get you those fractions of an employee. But the budget doesn't include a total increase of 3.4 employees. 3 of them are in the water area: water apprentice, electrician, 2 water maintenance workers. And Barry can talk about those a little bit when he gets to his budget area. And then also, you know, the public safety director is in there. We did increase a part-time position in the planning department from to full-time during the year. So it went from 0.6 of a position to 1, and that's where you get that other 0.4. Total
If I may add,
yeah.
You know, part of that, when I had mentioned, you know, about some flexibility, I know we've had a lot of discussion about a more aggressive property maintenance program, housing rental program, blight abatement, and that's part of where that addition comes in, is related to that.
Right. Okay, you just see kind of a history of where our total budget positions have been. We do have wage increases included in the budget. It's questionable at this time what we'll be able to do with the COVID-19 virus hitting us. So that'll be up for discussion with council as far as where we go with bargaining in the future. But all of our bargaining agreements do expire at the end of June of this year. This is just a reminder of what was in the capital improvement budget. As it was adopted, it was about $7.6 million. All of those items are included in this budget. Some of those costs were actually moved into the current year budget because we thought we may get them started prior to the new fiscal year. Questionable whether that'll happen at this point, but they are there in case that does happen. And if they don't get started, they would just roll back over to the next fiscal year for future spending. $3.39 million in street projects, $2.5 million in utility projects, and there's other infrastructure there of about $913,000, and then there's also some other smaller projects in there as well. Some of the items that are changed from last year's budget or other individual highlights, the Business Development Corporation agreement is going to continue or recommended to continue. But it isn't recommended to increase by $5,000 to $20,000, and just within our budget, it was moved out of the mayor council budget into the economic development department of budget. There is a recommendation to hire a professional lobbyist. At $36,000 was budgeted for that. That's included in the mayor council budget. Legal and consultant fees were reduced in professional and legal consultant budget, or basically the city attorney budget, because there are we're assuming we're going to be done with the DTE tax appeal, and we don't need to be budgeting $190,000 a year for that anymore. In the police department budget, they are replacing have replaced their tasers, and they're basically financing them. About $7,000 a year is included in the police department budget for that. And we kind of talked about the Winchester corridor study. That's included in the community development budget at the amount of $20,000. There is a little bit more money in that budget as well for contract services. So depending on what the plan for the year was for that, you might be able to do, and depending on how much they cost, you might be able to do something with the Winchester corridor and affordable housing. Just fire, continued turnout gear replacement. That's continued each year in addition to their equipment replacement. We've got $125,000 budgeted for demolitions. In parks maintenance, they've got some larger projects included within their budget, larger maintenance type projects. When I say large, they're less than $10,000 each, but good sized projects for them. The Battlefield Education Center, formerly the Multi-Sport Complex, has $80,000 budgeted for operations and maintenance. That covers the utilities, building insurance, and building maintenance. We've got $20,000 budgeted for building maintenance this coming fiscal year. That is going to be reduced. It's projected to be reduced to $10,000 next fiscal year, and then 22, 23, and beyond to be zeroed out. So at that point, all that would be left in that budget would be the utilities and the building insurance, and that would be about $60,000. The bond that constructed the facility, or the debt that constructed that facility, will be paid off during fiscal year 2023-24.
Mr. Sal?
Yes, I heard a question.
Yeah, before we get off the battlefield, 'cause I think Councilman Nicolangi, you have a question I think would be appropriate now.
Thanks, Your Honor. Vince or Ed, have we gotten back any feedback on how much the roof replacement is going to cost?
We have we had Jim Jacobs work an estimate for us. And Mark, I'm going to try and remember, it's 2 something is what we were looking at, 200 something thousand.
Yeah, I recall it was about 230,000, I think.
Yeah.
And that included the emergency caulk joint repairs that are going on now.
So we're looking at doing that through the building authority, and taking that up. We've authorized them to do some emergency repairs right now to not have any damage to some of the work that was there. But it's one of those things, obviously, when we have a chance with a work session to bring it back to council and talk a little bit about that. So, but the plan is to run it through the building authority for that improvement.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I see no other hands. Mr. Sal, please continue.
Okay. We've got included in the stores and equipment budget a couple of DPS truck replacements. There's a slide when we get to the other funds about the stores and equipment funds. We'll talk more about that there. An ongoing battlefield property acquisitions, the trust fund, our trust fund grant is going to continue later into this year, has been extended. So we're hoping to do some more acquisitions there. Copy machine replacement, second floor, City Hall, that's about 8 years old right now. We've budgeted in the IT fund to purchase a GPS unit so that our GPS or our GIS staff can go out and mark things and import it back into the GIS system. And then we're looking at, we've got budgeted in also in the IT fund to convert the GIS system to our current one viewer system that we have to a system through Esri. As we've had our GIS steering committee meetings, we've decided that if we want to really turn this GIS and do more of a planning tool and get more productive with it and turn it more into a management tool, that we really need to do that to open up some of the features that are available to us in the GIS. So that's budgeted at about $30,000 in the IT fund. So now we'll look at some of the general fund revenues. This slide is just a big summary of what's projected or what was. We have a wrong column heading there. That 2018-19 column should be 2019-20. That's, or excuse me, 2019-20 amended budget. But the main thing this is going to show is, you've got the 2019-20 is what we project the revenue to be this year. The main reduction between those two is that we are expecting the DT case to be settled, so that's going to reduce this year's revenue. We'll have to pay back some of the revenue that we actually received this year. So that's the main reason that there's a reduction between the current amended budget and the projected activity. But then going forward, you see some additional reductions in revenue. Not too bad in the next couple fiscal years, but then you start seeing reductions out longer you go in the property tax line. I'm into 23, 24, and 24, 25. And the bottom line there is the total. You can see that our revenues really aren't growing. You got to know that in 2019-20, there's about $2.3 million in there for the DNR trust fund grant. So kind of have to take that out of the equation when you're comparing the years. But even with that, if you looked at 2021, we're at 20.2 million, whereas down out to 24-25, it's at about 19.7 million. Our costs most likely are not going to stop increasing. So the fact that we're reducing our revenue is difficult to deal with. And that's where some of that $1.5 million that we had set aside comes in to cover that for the first 3 years, like Ben said. There's a slide coming here in a little while that just brings all the revenue and expenditures together and shows what it does in terms of an annual operating deficit or in the future years. This is just the same thing by graph, and the blue box here is our property tax revenue. The main thing this shows is that property taxes are by far our largest revenue. The next big one is revenue sharing. One of the things that's included in revenue sharing is our personal property tax reimbursement. So it's not all sales tax. In 2020-21, I believe it's about $1.2 million is related to the personal property tax. So you're talking about the amount that comes from sales tax is around $2.2 million. But that is the next largest portion of the general fund budget. And then this slide just points out the largest categories of revenue in the general fund budget. You can see the individual categories at the top there. You've got the request or the personal property tax is the top. If you focus on the 2020-21 requested budget column, that's about 69% of our total revenue. State revenue sharing is about 11%. Personal property tax reimbursement is about 6%. So all of those, you see the percentage next to all those items there. And in total, they make up about 96.5% of our total revenue that's budgeted next year. So it just shows that there's not that many areas that we can go to change our revenue. They're kind of are what they are.
If I can just stay there, just to follow. Oh, can you go back one? It's just again, the 2 points of concern: the personal property tax reimbursement. Again, because of the state's revenue challenges that I can assure you will probably come down and maybe substantially. And then the state revenue sharing is probably going to be down as well. So, two of the top three revenues will likely be coming down pretty significantly this upcoming year. So that's why, again, to keep that in mind.
So here's some more details about what's in the revenue. We've got a total taxable value decrease this coming year of 3.57%. That's comparing what we're projecting next year to what we were looking at last year at this time. Our revenues, taxable values generally just go up by the inflation multiplier each year, which this year was 1.9%. With things the way they are, it wouldn't be surprising, especially with fuel prices being the way they are, to see that be a smaller number next year. So that's why when we look at property taxes, it's not a short-term issue for probably this fiscal year, but for the future, it could be an issue because that inflation multiplier is going down. But taxable value reduction is estimated through fiscal year 25, from $1 billion down to $914 million. And I think Vince mentioned it already, but one of the things we look at what DTE's taxable value when this tax appeal started and what it's going to go down to over the next 6 years. But usually when we're budgeting, we're also budgeting for a CPI increase in that taxable value. So if you had it going up in the past, it wasn't just flat. So you're also losing that increase in addition to just comparing what the new taxable value is going to be to what it was. And that's one of the things that cuts into that $1.5 million more than what we had hoped it would.
Mr.
Revenue sharing. Yes.
Before we continue, just I'm checking to see if Councilwoman Whitman, if you're still at least in audio. I see you're muted, but you might have lost the video?
I'm still here.
Okay, that's fine. Just want to make sure that you're still.
I can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk.
I don't
need
even
your
know
permission to help.
this.
You may want to mute then for a moment, but you're with us and that's good.
This is the tablet that I only use for when we're at city council. I have no idea.
That's great.
I need to touch anything.
You're good. I'm just glad you're with us, and I'll let Mr. Sell continue. But if there, oh, there you are. We're all good. Okay, Mr. Sell, continue.
Okay. Revenue sharing was budgeted at 2%. Basically, we look at what was in the governor's budget projection, started there for next fiscal year, but then 2% in subsequent years. Obviously, that we'll have to keep a close eye on that because that's probably not going to happen at this point. Personal property tax reimbursement, there's a statutory calculation that we can do, but ever since that program came into place, we've been receiving over our 100% reimbursement. Our 100% reimbursement this year was around $620,000, but we're projecting to receive about $1.2 million. That money really is dedicated to capital to the St. Mary's storm sewer project. So if we don't receive that project will have to be looked at. Franchise fees have been reducing as people cut the cable on cable television. That's in the past that had been up to $330,000 actually, but projecting $300,000 next year and into the future, $290,000. So that's we share half of that money with Impact, and the city keeps the rest of it. The remaining DNR Trust Fund grant is budgeted in the current fiscal year. Whatever doesn't get used this year would be carried over to next fiscal year until the grant expires. This is what's recommended for millage rates. You can see in the FY 2020 column there what we levied this current year. In the fiscal FY 2021 is what's recommended for next fiscal year. No change in general operating or the fire station or the bridge millage. This economic development millage, we're capped at $50,000 of revenue. So because of the taxable value decline, the millage rate actually goes up a little bit. But refuse fund is the other increase there to keep that fund. We'll go over that as one of the other funds that we're going to talk about, but to keep that fund operating financially sound, we're recommending that it go up to 1.702. And then 1% property tax administration fee on all millages. So now we're going to get into the expenditures for the general fund, and this breaks just as a really, really high level look at how the expenditures are in there by broad functions. So you've got general government, public safety, and on down the list on the side. One thing to remember in public safety is that the state considers our zoning and code enforcement department public safety as well. So that's not just police and fire. But you can see the expenditures do go up slightly every year. They do go down a little bit in 21-22 because of that Medicare Advantage change that we talked about and not having contributions in the budget for post-retirement health care in the future. That's the main change there. But still at about $20 million by the end of that. I will say, and I think I have this coming up on a future slide here, but in terms of projecting the last 2 years, we had departments really submit their budgets, and then Vince and I go through and make changes to them as necessary through the 2022-23 years. But then I myself put in the 23-24 years and projected them as best I could. I should say I put in the last 2 years. And one of the things that I did there, knowing that we were looking at deficits those last 2 years, is I didn't include any kind of wage increase in those last 2 years. So that's one thing to know about those. If we were to have a 2% increase in there, it would be about $220,000 more per year.
Mr. Sell, before you next slide here, Councilman Angeli.
Yes, thanks, Your Honor. Ed, where is the in the previous slide? Where is the multi-sports debt service indicated or allocated? Is it under recreation and culture or under debt service?
It's under recreation and culture. You can see this last year here, how it reduces from 1.869 to 1.443. That's because in this year, that was the last year of the payment. The city general fund really rents the building from the building authority. So the general fund pays rent to the building authority, and the building authority pays the debt, the bond payments.
Okay,
So
thank
that's why
you.
it's culture and recreation.
Thanks.
Please continue, Mr. Sal.
Okay, graphically, again, this is how those are displayed. It shows you the amounts, and yellow, the bright yellow there being public safety, being the largest category compared to the others by far. General government and public safety being close second, or not close, but close seconds to each other. This then breaks that out again, just in different categories. Instead of looking at it by function, it's now looking at it by types of expenditures. So you got personnel, supplies, other operating, just another way to look at it. The capital outlay there is small because that's really just some capital accounts that are in the police and fire departments. Any capital that's funded from the CIP is really included in that bottom line near the operating transfer, and it's transferred. The money is transferred out to the capital project fund to deal with them. So we definitely do have more than that budgeted for capital, but those are the broad categories there. And again, this is that graphically. It just, the last slide and this slide show that personnel cost in the orange is by far the biggest cost there. And then this is a similar slide to what we looked at as far as revenues. It just shows your biggest categories of expenditures. And if you focus on that 2020-21 column, the requested budget, you can see that personnel cost is about 60% of the total. And that's net of what gets charged out to, is estimated to get charged out to other funds. So when the engineering and public services departments do capital projects or work on streets or winter maintenance, things like that, those costs get charged out to the street funds or capital projects funds. And so those costs are net of those. But then you've got some of the other larger other operating areas there, $460,000 for street lighting, $400,000 for the Port of Monroe. City grants there is the funding for the Arthur Leslie Community Center, the half of the franchise fees for MPACT, and the city library funding that we send to the county library system for the maintenance of the libraries. And then down at the bottom, you've got some debt service shows a big amount, the biggest part there being the OPEB bond that was issued. And then the operating transfers are really just related to primarily capital that's being transferred out to other funds. But the main thing to show there is all those categories together total 93.5% of total expenditures for the budget. So if in the future we were looking to reduce the budget somewhere, those would be the categories primarily that we would need to look at. We had a question come through when the budget first went out about what's the split for police and fire in terms, because it's, when we started going down the road of public safety, we create, instead of reporting the personnel costs for police and fire separately, we combine them into the public safety division department, and they're still that way today. And if, depending on what council decides eventually with the public safety assessment, they could get separated or they could stay together, just kind of waiting to see what happens with that. But in terms of what the totals are, you can see in that first section there, it shows the total personnel cost for police and fire for next year is about $7.98 million, with about 5.4 of that being police and 2.5 being fire. And then in the next section, if you add in the police operating budget, you see the total budget for police is $6.22 million. And then the bottom section is the same thing for fire. You've got their operating budget, which is, for both of them, is supplies and other things like that, contract services that they use. But for fire for next year, it's about $2.87 million. So that gives you an idea of what the total budgets are for each of those. And then this is finally brings it all together. This is a summary of where the general fund is projected to be over the next 5 years. We start at the top here. The total estimated revenues and total appropriations are what we looked at on the previous slide. So you can see this fiscal year, we're estimating that we'll spend $500,000 more than what we're bringing in. Part of that was the funds that, the biggest portion of that, part of that was the funds that we set aside for Labor Park, and the other part was just items that were spent or encumbered in last year's budget that got carried over to this year's budget. That does include $700,000 to be added to the contingency funds, to be added to the future reserve fund. But then you go on to the next 2 years and revenues equal expenditures, and then 22, 23, they start to get unbalanced with expenditures exceeding revenue. Not too bad in 22, 23 by about 136,000, but then they go up to about 530,000 and 430,000 in the next 2 years respectively. And then with those amounts in mind, it shows you what the total fund balance is just in the general fund. That doesn't include any budget stabilization fund money estimated to be at each of the end of those fiscal years. And then in the line below that, where it says fund balance, assignment balance, that's the running balance of the money we've been setting aside in contingency to deal with future DTE tax appeal or budget stabilization issues. Finally, on the bottom of that slide, it shows you where we're at in terms of percentage of the budget. So that fund balance percentage total takes that ending fund balance line and compares it to total appropriations and shows you what the fund balance is compared to that number. That does include that assignment balance. So what I did on the next line is subtracted that assignment balance to show you where fund balance was. And our goal would be to have that line be at least 15%, and it does that through 22, 23, but then because of the deficits in the last 2 years, it does start to drop below that. So that, again, is where we have some work to do. And then finally, if you were to look at total fund balance plus what's in the budget stabilization fund, which is $2 million, that shows what our fund balance would be at the bottom line there. So it's fairly healthy, and, you know, goes at the end where we're starting to see deficits each year. It gets down to 33%, which is still a pretty healthy number. So I thought I saw a hand raised there for a second.
Councilperson Felder.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilman Felder.
Thank you, Your Honor. These projections, these budget projections, were formulated before any impact that the city has responding to COVID-19, and we're already looking at increasing expenditures over decreasing revenues with loss in the fund balance there. Do we anticipate that any long-term reductions in the budget are going to need to be made in light of everything that's happening recently and what our numbers are showing here?
I would say more than likely, yes. The question, I think the timing is going to be the magnitude of the pandemic finance impact it's going to have on us. That uncertainty, you know, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that you know, how much of that 2.3 million that you have to work with can be applied toward you know, getting through the next fiscal year 2021 and 21-22. That really is, but I think long term we're gonna have to do something. Even we get those through, and the economy gets back to functioning near normal again. As you look out the last 3 years, and not so much the third year, but years 4 and 5, those are where we're going to have to do something, and it's consistent with what we talked about with the public safety assessment, that we have to start moving in some direction related to that. That is the largest discretionary expenditures that you have in the general fund.
Councilman?
Your Honor, if I may have a follow-up to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We all understand why it happened, but we have now had a budget session that's preceding both our public safety assessment decision and our goals and objectives finalizations. And we know why it happened. The budget has a fixed timeline that we have to abide by. But ideally, we would have liked that information that would have come from those two sessions as part of this to make a decision on what our budgetary priorities would want to be, as well as what some specific line items that are now being included in the budget would be, and if they were going to be approved to be in there based on the decisions of those studies. Do we have a timeline perhaps to review those, to be able to go back and make decisions that are going to have budgetary decisions dependent on them. I understand that we're sort of putting the cart before the horse here, and I know why we did it. We couldn't control it, and how do we rectify?
Mr.
I don't have a
Pastor,
good time frame for doing the public safety assessment unless we were to do it through a closed session using this medium that for discussion. I'm not sure it has the same benefit and effect as you know, sitting around for a few hours talking about the alternatives. But clearly, you know, I think you know, it's easily probably a couple of months away. Fortunately, the budget doesn't take effect for a couple more months, and I think in some ways, having a better handle on where we are with the effects of the pandemic will help with some of that dialogue. We'll have a better there's a big revenue conference at the state level scheduled in mid-May, and that really will give us a big idea as to where this is going. But in the meantime, there will be many other sources kind of evaluating that as well. But I still think that may be at least a couple of months away, given you know, the social distancing that's probably still going to need to be practiced for a period of time.
That's fair. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Your Honor.
thank you. Seeing other hands, Mr. Sal, please continue.
I think John has his hand raised.
John,
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilman Michelangelo.
Yeah, thanks, Your Honor. I think put it in perspective, just based on the numbers, public safety makes up 66% of the payroll cost. And over the next 2 or 3 years, if we're able to figure out how to reduce that cost by 5 to 7%, that comes out anywhere between $450,000 and $550,000, which then kind of mitigates the loss that's projected for years 22, 23 through 24, 25. So I don't think that's a large hurdle to accomplish within the next year, is figuring out how we can reduce those budgets by that amount of money. Ed, would you agree?
I would say I've seen bigger budget deficits than that in my career, so it doesn't scare me too much. And I think it's good that we do have a little bit of time to work on it as well. So, I think it's something we can do, but it's and I think there's some options out there for dealing with it. But I'm glad we have a little bit of time to figure it out. Yeah.
I'll tell you, I felt a lot better until 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
You know, there was plenty of time to give good, thoughtful consideration of how you're going to bridge that. But I will remind you that those last 2 years don't have any payroll increases. And so if you add another couple, at least 220 to each of those, the magnitude's a little bit greater. Those don't have any salary increases contained in there. So.
I mean, the big issue is we've seen, you know, we went through 2008 and we cut personnel substantially, so it would be really tough to do additional personnel cuts at this point. It would get to the point where it would really hurt. So it's much harder than it was last time around to find places to reduce the budget.
And the other thing to keep in mind, and you know, it's going to require some engagement with City Council and staff, is this Medicare Advantage implementation that we have been looking at and will be recommending here in the next few months. That's you know, a big potential savings that helps put us in a better position to deal with you know, that years 3 and 4 challenges.
Okay, just a follow, because Councilman Felder and Michelangelo, you're both on point. I think, you know, we have the facts we have now that we didn't have before as we started. That's one part. I agree. Second is, when you look at it, is really, it's going to take that time and effort for us as a council to go through that in detail. And hopefully that soon we'll have the ability to spend that time, but also collectively, and as we get through COVID. But yeah, we recognized before that there was one item within our budget in previous and currently where the significant amount of the general fund revenue goes toward. It's a topic we'll have to really weigh in on here, and hopefully we can do it sooner than later. But as we get through this, at least at this point, knowing we're not done in relation to our budget. And I think what comments made were very appropriate. So with that, if I don't see any others, Mr. Sal, please continue.
This slide just breaks out to how that fund balance assignment gets to its final balance that was on the previous slide. And we set aside $1.5 million last year, $700,000 this fiscal year, and then smaller amounts the next 2 years to get up to the $2.35 million. As of now, there's nothing in this budget projection that shows us using any of that. So that's out there for the council to consider its future use.
Okay.
There's just some highlights, additional highlights of what's in there. I think we've covered a lot of them already. 1.3435 million capital budget in 2021. That does include the extra personal property tax funds that we're expecting. The airport fund does have, or the general fund is subsidizing the airport fund by $45,000, and that's projected to continue into the future. So that's pretty much it for the general fund. Is there any questions before we move on to some of the non-general fund budgets?
If there's any questions from council, I don't see a hand going up. I'm just going to make a quick comment before we move on, because it's come up a couple of times. I know the council had this discussion, our goals and objectives on the airport. I think there's another item there for a lot of discussion for council. Really, what do we see the long-term use, purpose, partnerships, and opportunities that might present there? I think is something to keep on our list as well as we move forward. So I see that Councilman Lamore has his hand up. So Councilman Lamore, if you'd weigh in now.
Yeah, just a couple of things regarding the COVID-19 recovery. I know that the federal government has some things listed out for the states, cities, where they can get some of these funds back. How are we going to account for those in the general fund? Or is it something that is going to be accounted for in the general fund? I know it's kind of hard to predict that, but just a quick question regarding that.
Well, I think there's two components to it, if I might. There's been working with the departments. Mr. Sell set up a line item coding that would allow us to be reimbursed for expenses that are being incurred during the state of emergency. I think Mark had received something from County Emergency Management, putting together the structure that they'll need for us to submit reimbursements. So that's kind of more of the immediate part. We've done some work with getting those expenditures in line for potentially eligible FEMA reimbursed expenses. The other part is just the economic part, the magnitude. And I think that was one of the earlier questions. And we just don't have enough information yet as to, how the feds are going to be sending money to the states and then ultimately to the local governments to help with the financial impact related to this pandemic.
I'll just follow up on that. I did, like Vince mentioned, every department's been given a sheet that was sent out by the state just a couple of days ago as to what, like in terms of response costs, what might be eligible for reimbursement. So everybody's been giving that and supposed to be reviewing that so they know what could potentially be reimbursed through this. And then as we pay for those costs, we're tracking those through a separate project code in our financial system so that we can easily go to that code and look up all our costs that have been incurred. We're also doing that with payroll costs as well as we go by here. And just, I think it was yesterday, we got some information on setting up an account through the state's portal to start submitting those reimbursement requests. And so we've submitted our information, but they're supposed to get back with us in terms of activating the account, and that hasn't happened yet.
Councilman Lamore.
Yeah, just one more thing. Is there anything that you know of so far that accounts for lost revenue that we're going to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at some things, and obviously interest rates for investment have gone down, so that's definitely going to be one that's going to go down. Building activities are definitely not as active, and so our permit revenue in terms of building inspection activities is going to go down probably in the short term, definitely. So there's a couple areas right away, and then we've already talked about the state revenues, how will be affected there. But also, like Vince said, some of our industrial users are using a lot less water, so we're going to see less revenue coming in just for that area as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Other hands? Seeing none, we'll continue with the non-general budget or fund budgets. Mr. Sell?
Okay. Start out with the Major Street Fund, and the Major Street Fund is in large part funded by Michigan Transportation Fund revenues. So this was obviously based on projections from the Department of Transportation prior to the virus. The Department of Transportation did come out and say you should consider reducing your revenues, but they weren't giving anybody any hints as to how much they should reduce them by. So that's something we just have to monitor as we go here. But what's in there now is, and all the CIP that was approved as part of the capital improvement program is in there. But in the out years, 1.192 million is projected for fiscal year 21-22, and about just over that amount in the following year. For these other funds, we just did a 3-year budget projection. We didn't go out to 24 or the last 2 years like we did the general fund. So that's where they stopped. There's $25,000 allocated for a new pump for the front street flooding. There's a slide that will show the activity of the fund, revenues and expenditures, and fund balance in the second year. But fund balance at the end of the third year is estimated to be at about $615,000. That's about $200,000 more than the minimum I would usually like to have there. Transfer, because of some of the local street projects getting moved up to the current fiscal year, we actually increased the amount of funds that the Major Street Fund transfers to the local street fund to 26% for this fiscal year, but it's really 0 for next year. So we just advanced next year's transfer to this year to keep that fund financially sound. And then $890,000 is actually though budgeted to be transferred from major to local next year for capital funding. So that's 48%. The final Michigan Transportation Fund bond payment that was issued is in fiscal year 23-24. I actually had a call from, or not a call, but an email from S&P yesterday asking if we were going to have any problems making that bond payment. So people are looking into people's creditworthiness out there right now, that's for sure. Major Street Fund, this just kind of summarizes the revenues and expenditures. The main revenue is the state shared revenue line item here. That's the Act 51 funds from the state. And then the total appropriations each year is right here. You can see we had a big amount of capital in this fiscal year, so we're using quite a bit of fund balance this year, but then smaller amounts the following years. And so the fund balance actually gets down to about the minimum the next 2 years and then increases the third year after that. In terms of what was requested for capital as far as major streets, we're doing fine with the funding there. Local streets is another story. We'll get there right now. The local street fund, again, all CIPs included that was approved, and these are the amounts that were budgeted the subsequent year, the last 2 years of the 3-year projection, 814, 683. In total, they're about 1.13 million short of what we would want for full capital funding between those 2 years to do all the streets that were projected to need to be done in those 2 fiscal years. See somebody's got a hand up.
Yeah, Andrew, Councilman Felder, go ahead, please.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. As we discuss this and you bring up that shortfall, I was wondering if there's been any more discussions about setting up the capital improvements millage. I know there was a subcommittee set up for that, and I understand that with everything going on, that probably was not the top priority, but it's, as we're discussing this, it does seem pertinent.
It is. And I think that's probably something, I'm not sure at this point in time, one time we were talking about capital improvements, and to be honest with you, I really think that if the focus, and I think I may have talked about it in one of our work sessions another lifetime ago, late 2019, but we probably should just focus on residential local streets. That's really where our significant need is. And I think in some ways, without complicating a millage proposal, if you basically list the residential streets, that would be, I think, what people would understand. The parks and the sidewalk projects, the non-street projects, we would look to fund out of the general fund as we have in the past, but that'll be even challenged now given some of the forecasts that we have here. So, but I do think that it just should probably be the local street residential is where, if we're going to do a millage or consider it, that should be where the focus is.
Yep.
Councilman?
Yeah, it just, that's going to be one of those things that's going to have a hard deadline once we apply to have that put on the ballot, whichever ballot it's going to be. But yeah, I anticipated that it's really local streets where it's going to go. But
and if I may, Mayor and Mr. Felder, yeah, we probably got to decide somewhere. We had talked about no later than probably June or July for a November ballot, and so you have a better feel for the community than I do, in some ways, and so that's something we'll have to decide. Is it the right time now? The need's there. But certainly the timing is a more significant consideration than what it might have been just 3 months ago.
it certainly is going to be a tough time for everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Pastu. Thank you, Your Honor, for the time.
Thank you. See no other comments yet. Mr. Sell, continue,
Okay. Just one other note on there. Again, another pump was budgeted for the Bayview Glenwood area. And actually, both of those pumps are in this year's budget. So they're an amendment to this year's budget that you would be approving with the adoption of the budget ordinance. This, again, just lays out the projection. The state shared revenue grants is primarily the Act 51 funds. The other financing sources are really just transfers into the fund from either the major street fund or the general fund. And then the appropriations are the total expenditure budget there. And you can see the fund balance, it gets pretty low this year. That was the reason for advancing the transfer from the major local street fund into this year, but then rebounds next year and stays at about the minimum of about $100,000 about the last 2 years of the projection. I'll look at the refuse fund. And so we kind of already talked about what the recommended millage was for next year, but then in the out years, we also looked at what that millage would need to be because to keep the fund funded. And because of the taxable value decrease, we're looking at fiscal year 21-22, it'd be going up to 1.965 mils and then slightly higher than that in 22-23. I would assume that and estimate that it would go higher than that after that because the taxable value decreases even more after that year. So just a note that is something we're looking at for the future. The fund balance is estimated fairly low at 38,217, but within each budget, we also budget $50,000 worth of contingency. So you can really look at that adding to that fund balance each year. So that's why I don't worry about making it a higher number than that, because we do have some contingency built into the budget that millage covers. It is assumed that the full refuse millage or the refuse millage will be able to cover any costs related to the tax appeal or refunds related to the tax appeal as far as the refuse millage goes. And these are the services provided by the refuse fund: street sweeping, catch basin cleaning, refuse and recyclables removal, and then leaf bags.
Mr. Sell?
Yes.
Before we go on this, Mr. Pastu, I believe you may have some comments on this later toward the end of the meeting while it is a budget issue and in relation to the services and some of the challenges that are ongoing. But I know that there may be questions from the council. I know you're going to address some of that at the close meeting in your comments, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. So I just also council has some awareness for that later. Please continue, Mr. Sell.
Councilman Felder had a question.
Okay, and I see Councilman Michelangelo, yes. Councilman Felder, did you have a question?
I did, but if we're going to talk about it at the end of the meeting, we can talk about it there. The city manager had discussed in the previous meeting about having discussions with waste management about recuperation. So I anticipate we'll get an update later. I'll hold my question till then.
Yeah, yes, thank you. It's kind of what the topic for the council members, as well as some of the calls that I'm sure that each of us are receiving about this. So Councilman Michelangelo.
Thanks, Your Honor. Ed, you're projecting a $190,000 deficit in the next budget cycle. Why aren't we increasing the millage amount to compensate for that now rather than later?
Well, I don't like to jump and cover that real quick, because if you were to look at each of these 4 years expenditure line items, there's $50,000 per year built into a contingency line item that we likely won't spend. So, I mean, you've kind of got $200,000 there that eventually will roll into fund balance. And the fund really has a history of doing better than what it's budgeted. So I don't like to jump ahead and raise the millage at this time until we get a little further into it. It'd be something we'd review again next year.
And the other question I have, it's primarily something that the city managers talked about, is are we going to make any adjustments on how we charge rental properties that have more than 1 unit?
That's not incorporated into the proposed budget, but clearly one of those items that we've talked about where you can have some flexibility, and it will impact, what the millage levy would be associated. So you'd see a separate line item in the revenue stream for, multifamily assessments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, just to go on the fund balance, I think when you look at the ending fund balance projected for this current fiscal year at 223, that's a pretty good number, given the certainty that we have with the revenue stream and the expenditure stream as well. So I think, it's kind of funny. When I first looked at it, I got a little, I asked Ed the same question. That 50,000 that we set aside for contingency really gives us enough cushion, I think, for what we're doing, and kind of almost right sizes the fund balance where it needs to be.
Okay, I think Mr. Sell.
Okay. So we'll look at the parking fund. Because the main thing to look at with the parking fund is, I don't think we've had this in past presentations. It's really not been much to talk about, but what we account for in the parking fund is parking enforcement and also parking lot maintenance by the Public Services Department. And based on the projection that we've kind of worked on with the police department, it's looking like revenue may be declining because of, I guess, a number of things, but also they're concerned that the DDA is looking at a parking meter removal program. Primary income for the fund, really the only income for the fund, are the fines and the fees that are charged for parking. And based on the projection that I can just show you here on the next page, if we were to leave or actually hit this projection and see these revenues declining across here down to these amounts in the last year, we'd be getting down to a deficit in the last year of about $67,000. You can see that revenue here 2017-18 in total was about 170,000, whereas it's just a projection, but it's estimated at 133,000, and you can see that they did decline from 17-18 to 18-19, so it is trending that way. But that's the main issue with this fund. Something we have to work on as a staff is to determine how we're going to deal with that, basically, because I obviously can't have a deficit.
Mr. Sell?
Yes.
Councilman Michelangelo, you have a question.
Yes, Your Honor. I guess this is something that I've talked about before, and this projection kind of solidifies that. We have a program downtown, which is the parking validation program, where people pay a membership, which goes to the Downtown Business Association, and then members get to basically write off the tickets for their clients. But when we start running into a deficit, the issue I have here is that the general fund, the taxpayers, are paying for people to park downtown. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So the question is, do we put it in place a principal shopping district in order to assess the downtown property owners for the parking deficit that we're experiencing? Because I don't think it's fair that the general fund or that the general taxpayer has to pay for people to park free downtown because we're waiving the forfeiture fees.
And when we get to the DDA, if I may, Your Honor,
Yes.
you know, we did have some good discussion with the DDA board earlier this year about their budget and some of these very issues. We did discuss, you know, the principal shopping district and what its uses could be as well. So again, they have sustainability challenges with their revenue stream, and in many ways, you know, there's beyond just parking, other potential uses, maintenance, promotions that could go for that. And so unfortunately, as a result of you know, the shutdown, we just never had a chance to complete that discussion. But I do think it will, you know, reappear when we're able to assemble again.
See no other hands, we'll we'll continue on, and I know that's going to come back in discussion again. If not now, definitely later. Mr.
Yep.
Sell.
Yes. The Building Safety Fund, I know Vince has been wanting to do a neighborhood program or talk to the council about a neighborhood program, and I think it kind of got set aside because of the virus. But as of now, what's accounted for in there is all the building trades, inspection activity, the rental housing inspection program. This fund its financial health really depends on permit activity and how many permits they're doing, because there's not as much activity right there right now. The revenue will most likely decline, and so we'll have to be monitoring this closely to see how things are going. But as with the other budgets, this projection was done prior to the virus outbreak, and it's always going to be with this fund. It's going to be determined on how many permits they're issuing and what the value of those permits are. So we raised permits about, I think it was about 2 years ago now, and that did have a positive effect on the fund. And so these projections are based on a certain level of activity, and we just need to see how that goes and monitor it for the future. The Budget Stabilization Fund, just to note that it still is at $2.2 million, and nothing is budgeted in this budget to use any of that $2 million. The Airport Fund, I think we all know what that is. Really, their main sources of revenue are from fuel sales and hangar and farm rental. And also they do get some funds from the general fund. The fund balance is estimated at the end of the 3 years to be at about $110,000. That seems like a good number, but it actually wouldn't be enough in the future probably to make our state match that we need to make for future improvements out there. So we need to keep growing that a little bit so the general fund doesn't have to step in and subsidize it to a greater extent even. But the amount of support from the general fund that's budgeted here for each of the next 3 years, it just goes up by $2,000 per year. And then the hangar rental fee is in the increases in the budget ordinance. This is, again, just a summary of the activities there. This $104,000 is budgeted for fuel sales. Really, when we budget that, we look at the net of the cost of the fuel is down here, the revenue's up here. I think the fuel sales will actually be a bit lower than that, but by making it higher, it allows us to meet the budget requirements that are out there. And then the rental income is about, for the hangars, is budgeted at about $122,000. We're at there, and so you can see based on those budget numbers, you can see how the revenues, our fund balance grows from where it's projected to be at $57,000 at the end of this year to $110,000 at the end of the 3-year period. The General Debt Service Fund really just primarily accounts for bond issues for the bridge millage. So we had basically 4 bridge projects. We did two projects at Winchester. That's why there's 4 of them. And along with those bridge projects, we also had some city hall projects and DDA projects. So the city general fund sends money to this fund to fund the city hall bond payments, and the DDA sends money to this fund to make the DDA bond payments. The bridge millage and those transfers are the main funding sources. The final bridge bond was issued in 2017. Did a projection, even with the DTE reductions, that this millage should be adequate to cover all the current debt payments that are outstanding without having to get any kind of subsidy from the general fund. And then this just summarizes the budget projection over the next 3 years. You can see the fund balance is fairly healthy there. So as I said, it should be fine in terms of what it's supposed to do. Same type of presentation for the fire station 1 debt service fund. It pays the bonds related to building the fire station, and again, the millage there. When we did that millage and we did that bond, we did assume a 25% reduction in the taxable value of DTE. So based on the current projection, that millage should be adequate to pay all those bond payments in the future as well without any kind of subsidy from the general fund. And this is, we actually kind of collected that millage a year in advance of the bond payments coming due. So there's a good sized fund balance in there right now, and projected to grow a little bit over the next couple of years, but then it'll reduce over the years as the bond payments go and as as the taxable values start to decline a bit. Stores and equipment. This is the fund that really is kind of the city's motor pool fund. It accounts for all of our fleet operation. It has some other small and heavy equipment that are used on the streets and things like that. But the major and local street funds aren't allowed to really own any equipment. So this fund has to own the equipment and then rent it back to those funds as it gets used. DPS facilities are assets of the fund. So really the revenue source for this fund is this chargeback of rental of equipment that it owns to other departments. As far as personnel, there's 2 mechanics, and from time to time other DPS personnel do charge their labor to that fund as they spend time on that activity. The fund has old equipment that's in need of replacement, and we're starting the 3rd year of the enterprise lease program. We've placed an order. I believe we're close to placing an order, but because of the virus, there's going to be some delays in delivery of those vehicles.
Mr. Sal, Councilman Michelangelo, your question.
Thanks, Your Honor. Ed, has the enterprise lease program met expectations as presented a couple of years ago by the city administration?
Vince can comment too, but I think it has to some extent. I mean, the first year, I think what didn't happen the way that was projected to us is we didn't really get as much that first year out of some of the old equipment that we sold that we had prior to getting into the program. But it has really picked up this last year where I think it has started to meet those goals in terms of the way we were able to sell those items and get some good returns on them in this last year. So I think it's looking like it's going to work out great, but the first year was a little slow getting started.
Yeah, I think
Vince?
I think we're pleased with how it's progressing now. We've got a pretty good routine working with enterprise and DPS and with working the fleet and addressing any of those issues. So I think in some cases it's amazing with a couple of the decisions they've with their assistants have made to get a good return on what we had sold and purchased some items. So we're pleased with it, and I think there's room for a little more progress. So
thank you. No other questions, Mr. Sal?
Okay. I would say we did look at, as far as that program, we did look at including the police vehicles in it, but it was kind of late to get that started this year. So that's probably something we'll look at getting started next year when we start looking at ordering vehicles. As far as equipment that's budgeted for next fiscal year, there's $767,000 of equipment budgeted. About 500,000 of that is to swap loader trucks for the Department of Public Services use. One of them is about 300,000, and that one we're expecting to finance with an installment purchase agreement, most likely. The fund on its own can afford about 250,000 per year in equipment replacement that's not financed, and it does pay at this point for the police department's vehicle replacements each year. It's also paying for those enterprise lease payments each year. The working capital is, through the projection, it's fairly healthy at about 325,000. So if there are other pieces of equipment out there that we did need to purchase, probably not quite enough to get away from financing that one piece of equipment, but maybe some smaller pieces of equipment could be purchased for replacement. Some of the rental rates are controlled by MDOT, and we can't adjust them any higher than what they give us each year. But this is really just a projection. This fund is what's considered an internal service fund. So if you were to look at its fund balance, it would include the historical cost of, I guess I should say, depreciating cost of its capital assets, its trucks, its loaders, whatever they own out there. So in order to really determine how the fund's doing on a financial basis and what it can afford in terms of ongoing capital purchases, I break it down into what the actual working capital is, which is more of the short-term assets and liabilities. And you can see at the end of last year, it ended up with about 696,000 in working capital. And then if you take those cash inflows and outflows each of the years, by the end of the 3 years, it's still at about $325,000. So that's, it's not huge, but it's compared to where the stores and equipment fund had been, it's fairly healthy. So now we're under the Downtown Development Authority, and I'll confess that this is a list of projects that Annette Knowles gave me that were planned to be in the DDA budget because of the virus. We didn't really get to discuss the list much, and she probably would be here presenting the DDA budget tonight if this hadn't gone on. But I think Vince wanted to make some comments about the DDA budget at this point as well.
You know, other than there was a couple of meetings with the full DDA board talking about the budget and looking at the priorities. You do have a proposed budget, and my recommendation is adopt it, and then hopefully between now and July 1st, and even after July 1st, we can have the DDA board come back with a recommended amendment to finalize some of the work that they had started back in January and February.
Vince, if I just follow up to that, because as we're going through this in the DDA, we just missed it by a short meeting that couldn't be held. Was going to finalize and kind of streamline through some of these and what were the priorities. I think would have been a better prioritization list, but just didn't get there with that meeting. And so as Ms. Knowles puts this together, it's really, as Vince said, the idea is these are what were discussed. And then on the funding, when you look at that, it'll show the fund balance and the use there. But I think that's going to be, they're going to have to be strategic as we get through that, find out the priorities and fund those, but not knowing that last opportunity to have that meeting and discussion is why we are where we are today with this. So, Mr. Sell?
Let's just this is what was included in the budget that was submitted. So there is with all those things in there, there is a pretty good drawdown in fund balance next year. But as of this time, it's, I guess more to come on this budget in terms of whether all that's included or not. But we're asking you to adopt it as is at this point, but then this one's obviously could be amended as well. The Port of Monroe budget, this is the spreadsheet that the Port of Monroe, they've got a 3-year budget here as well. And at the top, they've got their projected operating revenue, which is about $670,000 a year. It's broken down into these 3 categories up here at the top. And then this middle section is their operating expenses, the biggest part being salaries and commissioner fees, and the next biggest part being contracted services, which they list out over here as to what those are. But in total, they're estimating to spend $1.135 million for operating expenses. And then if you go to the next slide, it shows their non-operating revenues, which is the biggest part being $400,000 from the city. And then also included in the expenses is interest related to the state loan, which the Brownfield Authority tax captures cover. So that's where that comes in there. So in total, it's a net zero budget, no change in net assets. And then if they were to have the funds available, they'd like to set aside $250,000 a year for infrastructure type work. That number has really been in the port budget for many years now, and it's only used, like I said, if funds are available.
Councilperson Felder has a question.
Okay, Councilman Felder.
Thank you, Your Honor. In contracted services as part of the port's budget, they had legislative listed. Are they contracting with a lobbying firm?
Yes, they do that as well.
If we have lobbying as part of our budget next fiscal year, would any advocacy on behalf of the port be included in that?
I guess I'll make a quick comment. Maybe Mr. Pastu will follow up. The point you're making, Councilman, is exactly, we've had a conversation with the port. Obviously, they have a lobbyist, and they've even offered in a partnership regarding a brownfield item to get support. So I think there's the opportunities for that discussion in between what we do and what they do, and how we may be able to join in getting the best from the expenditures from both. And Mr. Pastu, I'll look to you if you have something further on that, or Mr.
I think that's the fair statement that, talking with, Mr. Lamar there, that he has made an offer on a couple of occasions, to use that service. And I think by ours having it in there, at least, we got a point to start with, and maybe there can be some economies of scale by both of us working together. Although I think in their case, I will tell you, there's a handful of things that they probably had to pursue with a lobbyist on a couple of the projects that they did. But, I think we have to find what's the most effective use. And I think they're certainly willing to work, and obviously we will be as well.
Yeah, I'm not questioning. We all know what's been going on with the port and the necessity of what they're trying to accomplish legislatively down there and the issues that they're facing in doing that. So I do believe it's necessary on their part, but at this point we're sort of buying into that as well. Like you said, some economies of scale, some combination of those services might be prudent.
Yeah, we've had some crossover items. What their task or their path may be overall different, but there's been some crossovers. Councilman Michelangelo.
Thanks, Your Honor. Vince, Ed, I know that the one dock or wharf area that was closest to the former office is the one that is in need of repair, and they never have enough money to repair it. But if the dock were repaired, they could possibly get additional revenue. Does it make sense for the city, since the port is a city facility, does it make sense either in our capital improvement budget, or if we include it in a capital improvement bond, the money that they need to make the infrastructure improvements?
I have on occasion, with Mr. Lamar one time mentioned, look, if you would consider that, certainly I would think that the city council would be supportive of issuing, whether it's a capital improvements bond or anything through the building authority to finance a capital improvement if that was needed and necessary. So, I think at this point he hasn't, felt the need yet, but clearly I think he also understands and that the offer is out there. And, we certainly see the port as a phenomenally significant player in our long-term economic development strategy. And so, Mark works well with Paul and is in contact with him on a regular basis. And so if that need arises, I think they know that we're here to help where we can.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Councilman. Mr. Self, you could continue.
Sure. I think we're actually on to Barry now for the water and wastewater budgets. Are you there, Barry?
Yes, sir. I'm here. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity, Mayor and Council. I'm going to touch on wastewater first. I'll just start off with some goals that we're proposing for the next fiscal year. We're proposing to maintain our existing full-time equivalents. We did convert one unfilled position at the wastewater plant. We have it's really difficult to hire licensed journeymen for electrical positions, and we are developing an internal, we have a program that we developed with the Department of Labor, an apprenticeship program. So we've already hired an electrical apprentice, and that is taking that unfilled position. And I'll talk about the water plant as well when we get to that. Another goal is the exceed all of our water quality and regulatory requirements with our permit. That's an obvious one. Under that NPDES permit is our corrective action plan, which we've done a lot of work in the last couple of years. We've done flow monitoring, which is complete. We've developed a sewer model. We're currently in the process of doing some additional pinpointing. What we have found is 4 areas that have significant inflow and infiltration that we're removing. We were originally planning about a $15 million bond, which we actually don't need to do now, and we're proposing to fund that through operating costs over the next 5 years. That's a huge blessing for as far as from a ratepayer standpoint. We'll be able to pinpoint and fix these issues on a much smaller scale and more local. Also, we're expecting our next NPDES permit, which may have more mandates that we may need to deal with, especially with the work and the Lake Erie Adaptive Management Plan. So I'll keep you posted on that. Another goal, we have 2 capital improvement plan projects. One is rehabbing some smaller parts of the system, as well as the St. Mary's Garden area. We have some funding for rehabbing that. That is tied in with our corrective action plan. And then replacing a piece of equipment, which is our jet vacuum truck. Some ongoing goals, inflow and infiltration inspections. We do that through various means. We have a lot of partners with different jurisdictions to report cross connections to us to help us mitigate those. And we do have our footing drain disconnection program that helps with that. One item I want to mention with regard to education of customers, we had a few inquiries with recreational marijuana discharges to the system. I know Monroe Township is considering some legislation in their township, but it hasn't gotten very far at this point with regard to how we would handle that. We do have local limits with our industrial pretreatment customers that we would have to utilize those means and methods to handle that. Next slide, Ed. This slide is just showing revenue and expenses trends. The red is down here in the bottom is expenses and green is revenues. And then up in the tabular area, there's some highlighted yellow. The red text is our original budget from 1920, and then the projected is right next to it. There's 3 areas: the treatment and disposal. There's some increases in that, which are related to our electrical cost. They're gone up quite a bit. Our sanitary sewer maintenance program, it's directly tied into with our corrective action plan. We were planning on spending more on our design permitting portion with the fines that we've been able to utilize. We're actually, with the plan we're moving forward with over the next 5 years, we're able to reduce that for the projected portion of this fiscal year. And then we would then start using funding with that 5-year plan starting in the request year. And as far as pump stations, we have some lower costs from labor and some operating. Next slide, Ed. As far as overall, the budget is less than what we projected last year, primarily because we don't have to take on a lot more extra debt. But the operating and maintenance is increasing. That's directly tied with our corrective action plan for 2021. Labor is increasing as well with step raises and collective bargaining agreement that we're expecting. Excuse me. Depreciation is also increased, the value of the system. And then there's a small increase in reimbursable fees to the city for the general funding services. As far as specific areas that we're concerned with, obviously the corrective action plan area there under general contractual, and then the sludge handling. It's just really difficult to find haulers and places to take sludge. We currently have a nice system at this point on how we with vendors, but that is the prices are continuing to increase significantly. Next slide, Ed. This is just a graph showing the wastewater trends historically, going back about 10, 15 years. The projected number of units that we were billed, that kind of where we're going to now in 1920, I was actually a little bit higher than that. It just, we're trying to be realistic with what we're likely to collect from a revenue standpoint. And then we build that into this regressive model, unfortunately. So it is continuing downward, but that is built into our rate model, which we do look 10 years ahead. So this is a compounding issue that we have to deal with on top of other challenges. Next slide. These are the proposed rates for next fiscal year that we're proposing. The Wastewater Control Board is actually meeting tomorrow, and they'll be reviewing the rates as well. But this methodology of we switched to last year, it's based on meter size, and that recovers a portion of the meter reading charge and the recovery. On the left is the quarterly, and on the right is monthly. We are also going to monthly billing in the metropolitan side. Actually, this Friday is our first billing cycle. But we are recommending a small increase in this fixed quarterly and monthly charge. It'll collect more bond recovery for helping paying our bonds that we currently have, and then a small increase on the commodity charge as well. All other fees we're recommending to hold at this point. Next slide, Ed. What that means is about a 6.3% increase to the average user. In the four primary areas, our operating maintenance, about a 2.3% of that 6.3 is attributable to that. Depreciation is about 1.5%. Labor is about 1.3%, and the balance of 1.2% is reimbursable fees. The graph I showed is the reduced wastewater sales. Metropolitan makes up the city of Monroe, Monroe Charter Township, and Raisinville Township, part of that. And that's about 2/3 of the system. That's about 18% down. And what I'm using as the peak usage that we have historically is like 2006. And so this has been a slow decline since that point. Frenchtown makes up the balance of the system, and they're also down about 18%. So the anticipated usage is slightly decreased from the prior fiscal year. Next slide. This is a regional comparison. We're definitely in the lower half, and we're actually had moved up a few positions. $433 on an annual basis is what the average user will likely see. A lot of the smaller systems down below, or that are cheaper, I should say, they are smaller plants, more residential. And then a lot of these other systems like Woodhaven, Yucca, and Wyandotte, they send their sewage to a larger facility for treatment. So they don't have the infrastructure that we have to maintain this from an asset management standpoint. I'd be remiss without pointing that out. Next slide, Ed. And then as far as these are the different classifications for what the average user will see. The top one is the average residential customer. The next one is our sewer flat customers that don't have a water meter but are connected to the sewer system. Excuse me. And then below that are the different scenarios or classifications. So they maybe have a family or a commercial, or they're an industrial facility. What's important is to look at is the annual cost. The medium, we use a test, the EPA recommends less than 2% or less of the medium household income, and that's about $905 for our system, and we are definitely below that. And then I follow another study that as an alternative check, and that's a little bit less, but we are still cheaper than that. All right. Are there any questions in wastewater before I move on to water?
See no hands, so we'll continue.
All right. Moving on to water. So I want to touch on some goals. We have quite a bit of regulatory requirements in water as well. One of the big ones is the lead and copper legislation from 2018. Optimized corrosion control is one of our top priorities from that. We have to constantly be testing the system. We're currently in a system test right now. Another item that needs to be pointed out is we have field verifications. We have about 850 sites still to check. We have a 5-year time period to do that. What's important is we were able to remove about 70% of those from last year at this time. And a lot of that was record review and also getting into houses and being able to field verify things. Also, replacements are required over a 20-year period with the Department of Eagle, and that's for suspected lead and galvanized lines. We do have a request into them to extend that to 2054. And that reason for that is it parallels a lot of our street type improvements so we can coordinate services. I'm still have not heard an official answer from them yet or any type of other type of information they may need, but that is on record with them. As far as where we are in comparison to last year at this time, we've actually reduced those about 42%. Again, that's record research, and we actually replaced about 170 locations last year. So we have really improved those quite a bit, which you'll see in the budget numbers. Another regulatory item that we've is continuing to challenge us is the residential cross connection program. We've incorporate those with our daily work orders. We have completed about almost 800 of those last year. So we have to continue to increase those every year as well to complete the entire system inspection. We are just finished our year 1 of our meter conversion to our, it's called Badger Beacon, and it's an online an online meter reading system where we can see usage live. Year 1 was all of our non-residential customers, if you may recall, and that uses about 50 to 55% of our water usage that we pump into the system. We actually are going to monthly billing, and this, as I mentioned, this Friday is our first billing cycle. So we're moving into year 2, which is cycles 1 and 2 with residential, and that's almost 1,400 meters at this point. And then we will continue that process with future cycles on the remaining 6 years. As was pointed out, we are proposing some additional positions, full-time equivalents. 2 of these are directly related to lead and copper, lead and galvanized, those revisions. They have to do with adding field crew staff to replace lines, do field verifications. We do have a couple of system expansions that are being proposed in Exeter as well as London Township, and they would just help also with daily work tasks. And then at the water plant, the current water plant electrician, he's eligible to retire, and we have an opportunity with the Department of Labor approved apprenticeship program that we could hire and train, educate, and then ultimately license the electrician, and then be able to download that information from the current employee before he would retire. That's kind of the idea, just because it's so difficult to hire licensed journeymen with those skill sets. So that makes up the 3 new positions as well. Coupling that is the reduced water usage, which I kind of touched on with wastewater. They run almost parallel. That does include the ETE reduction. We had about a 5% reduction last calendar year from the prior year. So water usage is continuing, or reduction, I should say. Maintaining capital funds to renew our infrastructure per our asset management plan is a necessary requirement, as well as regulatory requirements. PFAS and algal bloom, well, it's actually microcystin, but it has to deal with algal blooms. There is regulatory legislation being proposed currently for implementing that that we may need to add additional treatment measures in place. Keep everybody posted on that. The net effect of that is rate increases. Last year, these were in the 8 to 9% range, so we have been able to reduce that down through a lot of hard work, but we're proposing about a 4.8% increase, then a 5%, 5.7. So next slide, Ed. This slide is very similar. It's expenses and revenue. The first one up here is administration. There's about a $500,000 increase. That's directly related to depreciation. During the audit process, there was a significant amount of special assessment districts that were paid off those bonds in Raisinville Township, and we, by our contracts, we took those on as assets officially. So our book value of the system went up as well as our depreciation. So that's why that's increased. The filtration division is increased because we have a coagulation basin basin that is abandoned, and we need to demo that. So that's directly related to that demolition cost. Transmission distribution is dropping primarily from the field verification process and reduction in number of services we actually need to replace. And the meter shop is dropped slightly, and that's because of our meter conversion program. We have less contractual services that we needed assistance to complete that work. Next slide, Ed. So overall, for the fiscal year 2021, we have some, the budget is slightly less. There is increases in labor for step raises and the 2 maintenance worker 2s that we're proposing in the apprentice. Depreciation is up slightly, and the reimbursement fees back to the city is also increased. There's some specific areas mentioned here, and as far as the efficiency, we're trying to right size our staff with the number of people we're proposing. Next slide, Ed. As far as consumption, this is a kind of a short-term trend, but we have the DTE reduction in 18-19, and you can see we have a slight regression with what we are observing in the system. The phenomenon continues with active connections. They continue to increase. That's primarily in residential. So we have kind of a less usage by the industrial customers, but we have more residential customers. So the usage per connection is certainly dropping, which is what we've been observing. Next slide, Ed. As far as rates go, we're proposing to maintain our fire line charges, pump surcharge, our administration and debt service recharges. We are proposing to increase our system development fees, and that's primarily due to the value of the system going up. And that's using our 2005 rate study methodology. And we also are proposing to increase our commodity charges. I do have a side note regarding the city of Petersburg. That's currently, that amendment is currently being developed along with the U.S. Department of Rural Development. We're working through those. So I will plan to bring that to City Council for consideration as soon as we're done with that. It does include a 1.2 multiplier. They are a wholesale customer, just like Dundee. They currently are charged 1.0 times. So we will bring that back to City Council when we're done negotiating that. Next slide, Ed. Here's proposed fees at this point. On the left is quarterly, and on the right's monthly. We have the commodity charges shown for in-city customers, out of the city customers, as well as out of the city with a surcharge. And down at the bottom is our wholesale rate. Next slide, Ed. These are our fire line charges. And then here's our system development fees. And that's fine. You can go to the next one, Ed. No, you're fine. And then this is our regional cost. We're still the fourth cheapest, I should say. We're doing really well with as far as a system in the area. And then our out-of-city customers are also highlighted, and our wholesalers on this list. Again, in 2.5% or less of the medium household income is recommended as a guide for checking their annual costs, and we are definitely below that. Next slide, Ed. And this last slide is our revenue. The average customer will see about a 4.8% increase. And the breakdown is there with labor, depreciation, and reimbursement. Again, we had about a 20% reduction in operation and maintenance from what we were originally proposing. We'll continue to work at that to, not have increases. The reduced water consumption. Those four different areas make up about 93%, and of the entire system. So it is definitely a trend. And then this is this bottom slide, or bottom part of the slide, is what we have built into our rate model. And as far as the consumption goes, what we're planning for at this point. With that, is there any questions?
Looking to the council, see if there's any questions for Mr. Leroy. I see none. Oh, Council Michelangeli.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I took a look at, Barry, what your average rate for residential at 433, and for water it's 118, and that's 641 a year. And that comes out to roughly $53 a month, which is, compared to some people's cable vision, is probably a third of the cost of their local cable. So, I think you have to put it in real terms. That's a pretty reasonable price for getting two very important commodities, water and wastewater. So, just a comment. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions, comments from Mr. Leroy? Thanks, Barry, for the information, and I know that it's information for everybody to look through as well.
Thank you.
So I guess at this point, I'll may ask Mr. Pastu, but I may want to see if the council has any general comments or overall comments they might want to include at this point. But I'll give Mr. Pastu first the opportunity to, is there any kind of a wrap up or next steps, I guess, is appropriate where we go next.
Well, I think in some ways, if there's any thing with council that they would like to discuss further or contemplate, any changes before the budget's adopted, we'll be sending it out tomorrow to council, but it would help if there's any changes that you would like to consider before final adoption.
Councilman Michelangeli. Councilman, I think you're muted. Try again.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. I have a couple of questions or comments. One is, it's kind of consistent with what Councilman Felder had mentioned relative to the fact that we haven't had a detailed discussion on the public safety program yet. So my suggestion is, is that we take the money that you have projected or proposed for the public safety director, and at this point in time, put it in the contingency part of the budget until we, as a council, can have an opportunity to sit down and talk about the public safety study, which we have not had an opportunity to discuss. Secondly, because of the projections overall relative to DTE, there was a slide that said that we really should take a look at a public safety short and long-term plan. And because they make up 66% of the budget, and because Fitch just finished the public safety study, I would suggest that we put some money in the budget to do the next step, which is to really either bring Fitch back because they've got the data and they've been through both of the departments, is to take a look at what the next steps would be in terms of coming up what a reasonable deployment or staff allocation and organizational structure is needed in the future, both short and long term. I hate to wait for another year and then start another study and have it finished a year later. I'd rather, if we're going to do it, let's just keep moving in that direction. So those are my two suggestions, is to take the public safety director and all of that cost, put it in contingency until council can talk about public safety. And then let's think about the next step for a short and long range plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilman. Other comments, thoughts from council? Trying to keep up with the hand raising.
Your Honor, if I may.
Councilman Felder.
Thank you, sir. I would also feel more comfortable with that money in the contingency fund until we have the opportunity to discuss it more broadly in that issue. Again, back to the previous point, we all kind of know why it happened, but until we have a chance to discuss it more in depth, I think holding off on it would be best for the short term. And I'm sort of on the same page as Councilman Angeli in the sense that I don't believe that Fitch has entirely checked all the boxes on what we had put out in the RFP. Initially, I think that there were concrete proposals that we were anticipating hearing back on in terms of finance and organizational structure, and I'd like to see something on that before we essentially say, okay, we're done, you're good to go. I think that there was more. I was anticipating more. I think I've detailed that in discussions with the city manager in the past. Hopefully that's not a surprise. That's where I stand. Thank you.
Other comments from council? Don't see hands. Mr. Pestu was going to say something.
Yeah, Your Honor. I have no problem taking what we have allocated for the recommended for the public safety director and moving it to contingency, just for purposes of if there is an interest on the council with a little more work from Fitch, if because it is budgeted in a public safety activity. If you left maybe 15,000, gosh, I don't know if we'd need that much, but if you left something to maybe finish it up and then move the rest into contingency from the director position, I would, be certainly comfortable with that. And I'd probably ask Ed, can you whip that together? And well, you know what, we might just have to make that recommendation or make the change there at the meeting Monday night, if that's the pleasure of council.
Yeah, I think that's what we would probably have to do, because we already published the budget ordinance as it was originally presented, but
yep. I
can have a revised version on everybody's desk that would show what the change would be.
So Councilman Felder, and then I'll have some questions or comments also.
Has Fitch, a question for the city manager briefly. Thank you, Your Honor. Has Fitch exceeded their D&E number yet?
Their what?
Do not exceed number. They had an initial amount and then.
Yeah. I don't, Ed, where are we at with that? Do you have any recollection off the top? I think we're pretty close to where we thought they would be, so.
I was just looking that up. I think there's about a little over 8,000 left that we didn't spend. I believe we made the last payment to them on the first agreement, and we've got about 8,000 left that we didn't spend, budgeted.
You want to work with that, we can, but before I would re-engage, I'd probably want to talk with you a little bit more specific about what additional detail and even if it's a facilitation to, if that's what you might think would be helpful.
Is that question to me?
Yeah, in general to everybody. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I would think that, if we got $8 grand left and still, that we could re-engage them to maybe do a little more work to meet, what you may have expected. And, but I would have to figure out exactly what that might be and whether you want them to participate in a facilitation at the end of kicking around the ideas like we had talked about, the recommendations and a little more.
I think I would just circle back around to the to our email correspondence in the
Okay.
bullet point that we had identified previous. I don't know if I sent that in January. I don't know if that should be.
It was late January, I think, yeah. Or after, maybe early February. Yep.
But I think that has very specific points on things that we would like to look for in terms of what the anticipated expectations are, at least from my perspective, and what we had put out in the initial RFQ.
Okay. All right. I'll do the reconciliation on that. And but would there be any pushback if we said, now that we got $8,000 out there, if we just left 10, if there's something additional, just so we don't have to come back and do a budget amendment on that item? We'd leave 10 in contractual and then move roughly 170 into contingency.
I'm in favor of it.
What's that? Okay.
I said, this is Councilman Angeli. I think we need some final numbers that were in the RFP relative to staffing allocation. So if we have 8 and we have to put in another couple of thousand to round out the study, I'm in favor of it.
Okay.
Oh, I'm saying, Hans, I'll just make some comments. We've talked about this for a while, and I think it pretty much came to a consensus about a public safety director. The fact the money remains within the public safety ensures it's there, but it doesn't ensure what it gets spent for if there's something else that changes. And my concern about that is we can have it facilitated, but if the revenue then gets used elsewhere, then we don't have the funding for the position that was discussed. I think that, Fitch facilitating, I don't have a problem with that, because I think that we're probably going to need some support there to kind of dialogue through all that from that. And since there's some additional funding to do that, I would support, as was said by Mr. Pastou and the councilman. So, but I think keeping the public safety director's position or the funding there, then that's what it's there for. There's always a budget adjustments later if so the council felt differently, but putting the contingents, I think, then gives it the target that it could be for something that might be a need based off of we don't know what happens next. I think the working through the dialogue on the public safety is going to require a public safety director for us to have success. We can have the Fitch come back and tell us the positions, but the facilitation of that is beyond just the positions and the people. And I think that's where a lot of the contract discussions is going to happen. And for us to go through all that, not have a public safety director there from the beginning, then we're trying to tell that person what it is something should be, as opposed to somebody that has experience on both sides of the house that comes in and can actually be a participant in the discussion. So I'd like to see it remain within the line item as a public safety director. Knowing the money's not going to go away, I'm not saying that, it just, it becomes other options for it. This is my comments. See if there's other, Councilman Angeli.
Your Honor, I understand where you're going with it, but the bottom line is that a municipal budget is also a policy document. And if we leave the public safety director's position in the public safety budget, it's kind of a policy statement that the council is in favor of it, even though we want some additional numbers. And at this point, until I get the additional numbers and I see what the organizational structure is, and I see which direction the council is going to go relative to either a public safety department or a police and fire department, or the idea of the fire authority, I'm not inclined to keep it in the public safety department budget, because it's a policy statement that's an end goal for council. And at this point, without having a really good discussion on public safety, I would prefer to have it in the contingency, knowing that we're not going to spend the money on anything else. I mean, we put it in contingency. I think we did a couple of years ago. We put the public safety directors in contingency. I don't think we spent the money on anything else, to my recollection. Thank you.
Okay, I'll see if there's a hand. There's not. I guess I kind of thought the same thing in reverse. When it's not stated that there's not a public safety director funding line item, it is a policy, then it's not important, or it's not something that is what we've been at least directed through our first response from Fitch, but also back when we had the I'll say somewhat of a analysis done by the person that came through SEMCOG also suggested that. And that one didn't get, some of those items were pushed forward, but that wasn't one of them. Having a contingency means it doesn't have a priority. And I think it's a priority that we've talked about if we think we're going to be successful in a public safety, no matter the structure is where there have been shortfalls, is the ability to get the best out of both departments. So that's why I guess we see it the same way from the opposite sides, maybe. So I'll see if there's other comments from council. Councilman Felder.
I have one, Your Honor, if I may. Thank you, sir. I guess putting the position in the budget before the position itself has a scope of work or a defined role in what we're going to do with that position and what the expectations are, and you're budgeting for a position that you don't know what they're going to do yet if you do hire them, because we haven't had that conversation yet. I think it's critically important that we define the role that we're expecting to be filled by that position before we put money for that job role. I mean, if you were to budget for it now, I don't know, if we were to hire for it, what we'd ask them to do, because we haven't had the discussion yet.
Councilman Vining. I know
I'm attempting.
There you go. Oh, now you're back in.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. I just want to be clear. Have we ever even voted that we wanted to have a public safety director?
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Councilwoman. And
then I wanted to ask about the statement John made that if we do put it in the budget before we decide as a council that we intend to have that position, does that solidify the position in the budget?
Your Honor.
Mr. Pastu.
Yes, part of it is the manager does submit a recommended budget, and the recommended budget from the manager was to put that position in there. And again, that's a function of the recommendation that we had with our consultant, regardless of which of the three alternatives that we selected. So, I mean, we're probably going to have trying to think how I might do this, where you can literally keep the funding in public safety, and I can reduce the position allocation so the position isn't yet allocated to go forward in there. And that way, we know it's in the public safety area, but at the same time, it's not an allocated position that can be went out to be filled. If that's a compromise that everybody could work with, that would be fine by me. I mean, we're not going to fund the position until we've had the discussion, or we're not going to go out and purchase anything. So the appropriation would be there. The position allocated wouldn't be there yet. Does that make sense from a budgetary standpoint?
Well, I guess once you put it together, make sure it comes back with the next meeting. That way, I guess we can understand how it reads and understand that, something to send out. Councilman Michelangelo, I saw you do have your hand up.
Thank you, Your Honor. I don't have a problem with Vince is talking about, as long as it's specifically articulated at the council meeting in a statement, because I don't want it getting in the newspaper that part of our budget includes the position of a public safety director, because that's really not my intent at this point in time until we have a detailed discussion on the public safety study.
You can have the appropriation in public safety area without the position being recognized as a allocated position by the city council. And rather than moving it out of public safety, you can, to contingency, you just don't have the position recognized as an approved position for the upcoming budget.
Councilman Felder, your idea.
I would be more amenable to that. I just want to have a discussion on what we anticipate and expect from that position when we're going to fill it and when we're going to put it in the budget. I don't want to I don't want to do it the opposite way. I don't want to budget it and then decide what we're going to do with it later.
Understand.
Because until we have that discussion and until we have operationally how we're going to set this up and what the needs and demands of that new organization are, that will help determine what support services will be required to achieve that goal. In terms of workload and in terms of whether additional people are required to fulfill that, in terms of what the roles of the current players are in terms of the police and fire chief. I think it's certainly a critical discussion to have, and I think it needs to happen in the right order. But I would be more amenable to the city manager's proposal.
Okay, Mr. Pastu, then I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. Why don't you put that in a fashion so we can see it leading in? I think kind of what Councilman Michelangelo said gives us an idea what it is and how it is and how it would be implemented in the budget.
If that's agreeable with the rest of the council, Mr. Sull and I will put that together for consideration next Monday night.
Okay. Other items on the budget from council members? Okay, I don't see any. Oh, Councilman Michelangelo.
Your Honor, just as long as I don't think we don't have to really discuss it as part of the budget, because I think it's going to take some other council decision making, but I don't think we need to lose sight of the fact that we've got to do something with the downtown parking, because I don't think we need to be in a position where the taxpayers are paying for people to park downtown. So I think that's got to be a priority that council takes a look at, because that's not a projection. That's going to happen next year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other comments, items of the budget? I don't see any hands go up. Mr. Pastu, you final comments for tonight?
Not related to the budget.
Okay. So I think if there's not, I think we're ready to move forward to the next item. Councilman Felder, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Your Honor. Question with the refuse millage, and this might be something that the city manager wants to talk on later. But with regards to the budget, we had discussed last meeting about potential reimbursements for services not provided by Waste Management during with what all's going on. I wonder if there was any developments on that, and if there was going to be any discount or charging at the trash rate, not the recycling rate, because the recycling is all just going to be landfilled temporarily anyway. So why are we paying extra for them just to throw it in the trash? Thank you.
Yep. Especially
The first portion of it is that we've had, I don't know how to describe it, but Waste Management has not experienced necessarily the staffing loss that they have anticipated, and their collection of yard waste and bulk items has been intermittent as resources are available. And so it's created, I put a predicament for us, is because, you know, we would prefer to have regular predictable service. And in talking with Mr. Lewis earlier today, is basically his staff has said, you know, when they've had calls from residents, is if you have yard waste, put it out there. If they're not able to get to it, then the next day, you know, just take it back in. We're trying to get them. Yeah, I see that, and I agree with you. That frown is justified. It is frustrating, is that we would like the predictable service, but we are hopeful that within the next week they may be able to give us a definitive answer. You know, related to the landfill piece, I mean, there is a cost differential of landfill versus taking it to a materials recovery facility. And so that dialogue will have to take place with them. It has not yet at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Pastu. I think there may be some other comments. I see Councilman Michelangelo has a comment. I'll have one as well.
Okay. Your Honor, no comment regarding the refuse. I know it's an issue. Just a procedural comment. Does the special meetings require the 2-hour limitation that we have?
That's right.
Looking at Mr. Buds or Clerk Treasurer Lavoie.
I thought that was just the work session, but I could be wrong.
believe that's accurate. I'm pulling that right now, but I believe that can also be handled by a vote to extend. And so I would encourage, if there's a motion and a second to continue and a vote taken, to continue that special meeting while I confirm that in the text here.
Your Honor, I'll make a motion that we extend the meeting.
Second.
Motion by Councilman Icolangelo, supported by Councilman Lamore, to continue the meeting if necessary by the charter. Clerk, you want a roll call or? Oh, she's on mute, but
Sorry, Councilperson Germaini,
Yes.
Moore,
Yes.
Felder,
Yes.
Whitman,
Yes.
Icoangeli,
Yes.
Vining,
Yes.
Mayor Clark.
yes. Just a quick comment, I guess, and we'll move on from the refuse, because Mr. Pastu and I did have a conversation, because I noticed today in precinct 1 for the trash collection, the yard waste that some residents put out, not knowing that we weren't collecting, was getting collected. And I seen that's kind of what the message was here today. And I think Mr. Pastu hit it right on the head there. We need predictable service, not is it going to be today or next week or the next day, and people moving it in and out. So I know, I'm sure many or probably everybody in council at least got one call or text about it. I have as well. And I think that we need a consistent message, and Mr. Pastu is going to follow up on that. Mr. Lewis as well, to make sure that we can tell the residents one thing about what we're doing or not doing, or what waste management is or not doing within the contract. And then it gets to a budget part of it. Then we can calculate what services aren't being provided according to the contract. And then there's no questions or, well, we really did it this day, you just didn't know. So I think we'll get there. I appreciate it, Mr. Pastu. I know you're going to follow up. So
We will, if I can have a follow-up for council Monday night. I know Patrick and I had talked about it earlier today, and hopefully we can get something definitive from them.
that'd be great. Other budgetary items? Okay, there's no action for this tonight, as I understand. I'm looking at Clerk Treasurer Lavoy. I think there's no other comments. We can move on to the next item. Next item.
All right. The next item is under council action, item 2715, COVID-19 resolution number 5.
Thank you. And I think City Attorney Matt Buds, I think you're going to walk us through this, and as we move on to resolution 5.
That's correct, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor and Council. If you'll give me just a moment, I will share a screen here so that we can go through if there are any questions on that resolution. Give me just a moment. All right, so you may have in front of you from my earlier communication what we're calling COVID-19 resolution number 5. I will say a lot of the whereas clauses are similar to those that have been in prior COVID-19 resolutions. So I'm not going to address a whole lot on page 1 because that's fairly consistent with our prior resolutions regarding this matter. I will point out that there have been some changes to the executive orders that Governor Whitmer has issued. In this area, we talked about Executive Order 2020-15, which was allowing meetings to happen as they are with this Zoom meeting remotely. And that executive order was actually rescinded and replaced with Executive Order 2020-48, which extends the period of time for remote meetings to occur until May 12th of 2020 unless further extended. So as you'll see later, that causes the city administration to ask for some additional action regarding upcoming meetings. Additionally, the governor took Executive Order 2020-21, which was the, I'll call it a stay in place or stay at home order that was in effect, and has replaced that with 2020-42. That remains in effect until the end of the month, April 30th at midnight. And there was obviously a lot of discussion about that and some activity in Lansing today. I guess I'll just say in response to that, for our purposes, then the remaining whereas clauses talk about prior actions of City Council with resolution number 3 and number 4. And so the action items for this evening that are being proposed in the resolution are to have all city, to have City Hall and related city operated buildings closed through May 11th, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. I will note that that goes longer than the current stay at home order but in discussion with Mr. Pastu and city administration, the thought process there being that it may take us some time to get City Hall cleaned and in a position to be ready for members of the public to come back in, and also that the clerk treasurer will need to use City Hall for the election that involves the Monroe Public Schools millage question, which is going to be held on May 5th. My understanding in talking with the clerk treasurer is that we are required to have one polling location open, even though the goal is to have as much of the election conducted by mail as possible, and that polling location will be held at City Hall. So that will give time for that cleaning thereafter and for sort of an orderly reopening of City Hall in the event that the governor doesn't take further action or extend the stay-at-home order beyond the end of this month. Again, we have a provision that states that Mr. Pastu, in his role as city manager and emergency preparedness coordinator, can take other action regarding the opening, closing, or occupation of city-owned buildings. We do have one, I'll say, slight hiccup on our proposed schedule for next Monday's meeting, April 20th. We had in a prior resolution number 4 talked about holding that meeting at 6 as the regular meeting and not having a work session. In reviewing things, I want to give a thanks to Mr. Cochran for reminding us all of this. There was a public hearing notice given on the Corridor Improvement Authority plan, and that was noticed for 7:30 p.m. So this resolution, if passed, would move that regular city council meeting back to its normal and ordinary 7:30 time without a work session before at 6. So we would meet at 7:30 this coming Monday to make sure that we have that public hearing as noticed. And then we will also need an election commission meeting for the city council meeting as election commission. And we would propose to have that at 7:25 this coming Monday. We would also state that the same remote or technological means we're going to use for both meetings, essentially that we'll put out one notice that will cover a Zoom meeting that will have both the election commission and then the city council meeting, where I would anticipate the mayor in presiding over those meetings will handle it much as we would if we were there in person, calling the one to order, closing it, and then calling the other, not having where we need to leave one Zoom meeting and start the next. And I'm comfortable with that under the executive order. The other provision then further below is at the May 4th meeting, which will now also be covered by the governor's extended order regarding remote meetings. For May 4th, that we would cancel the work session to be held at 6 p.m. and move the regularly scheduled city council meeting to be held then at 6 p.m. on May 4th. And then lastly, the city's Human Resource Department and administration in collaboration with Labor Council had drafted a new and revised extended pandemic leave policy, which was attached. And if you could answer any questions about the idea, essentially extending additional time for employees due to the COVID-19 emergency, and also incorporating the provisions that went into the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which required certain leave to be provided to our employees. And then lastly, if there were any further extension of the order on remote meetings, that we would take advantage of that if that were to be necessary under any additional orders. So that's the provision. I don't know if anyone wants to speak or ask questions further on the pandemic leave policy, but that's a quick review of the resolution number 5 that's being proposed.
Mr. Buds, Councilman Calangeli has a question, so we'll do that first and then see if we want to review the extended pandemic leave policy as well. Councilman.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Pastu, do we have a large agenda for next Monday?
We do not.
Okay, I was just wondering if we did, we could always have the public hearing at the end of the meeting and start the meeting sooner, but if we don't have a large agenda, I guess we could start 7:30.
No, it's basically the two significant action items. There's actually 3. We've got the budget public hearing, we've got the corridor improvement public hearing, and certainly the adoption of both of those we'll be requesting. And then we've got the Lake Erie Transit millage proposal renewal for the August ballot that we would have there. So those would be the 3 action items. And then I've got, I believe, 3 consent items that'll be on the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions for Mr. Buds on the resolution 5? And Mr. Buds.
Councilperson Lamore.
Councilman Lamore, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Your Honor. Just had a quick question regarding lawn maintenance contractors. How does this affect them or our position with them in any way?
So I know Mr. Pastu has that on his list as well to review. I know that I'm sure calls have been received by the council members. I know I've received a few, as well as emails regarding the governor's executive order. And the big topic right now is lawn maintenance companies. This here would simply continue as to what we'll have to discuss at the end here, what that means by the executive order and how it's worded. Mr. Pastu, I don't know if you want to speak to it now or later.
No, I can talk to it right now. It's
okay.
Clearly the governor's executive order does not deem lawn maintenance as essential, even if it's individual, separated, providing the social distancing. And so that's been pretty clear and straightforward. And so, I've had my share of calls with contractors and, look, this is the executive order and essentially the law of the land. The one thing I will say is that we do as a city have an exemption for parks. Our contractor had done an early cut last week. And I talked with Mr. Lewis. I said, just sit tight, have them sit tight until the 1st of May, and we'll see where that's at that point in time, because it's kind of difficult to take a position where other, contractors can't perform work. And yeah, we've got an exemption. So I think we're fine until May 1st, and then we'll, certainly catch up at that point in time. I assume that portion of it at some point is going to have to be lifted.
Councilman, I see your hands up again. I'm just going to quick follow up because I know that this is a topic that's getting discussed locally as well as in Lansing, the Michigan Municipal League, the Mayor's Association, legislators. This topic, I think, is one that's probably going to continue to get discussed. And I know the governor on her executive orders has adjusted on some after conversation or items that come up. I can't say this is going to be one of them, but I kind of agree with Mr. Pastu as I talk to it through the people is, if we start to say, well, I know other mayors have, and there's municipalities and said, well, we're going to allow it anyways. Well, then what's the next one that's going to ask? And it just keeps the next to the next. And my concern is that we can expect additional calls on something else that's important to that person. Councilman Lamore, you have your hand up for a follow-up.
Yes, I do. I mean, my main concern with this is that we do have an ordinance for how high the grass gets in town. And there are certain people that don't do their own lawn that do require a lawn maintenance company to come in and do their lawn for them. So how do we handle a situation like that? I mean, because it is basically for the health and well-being as well.
Certainly understood. If I can, your mayor,
yes.
Respond. As a practical matter for the city of Monroe, we cannot enforce by ordinance our high grass requirement until after May 1st. So there is also an element of it. But I know from an aesthetic standpoint, once the grass starts taking off, it goes fast. And so, but from an enforcement standpoint, we can't enforce anything until after May 1st, anyways, by ordinance.
Councilman Lohr, any follow-up?
It just leaves a vast opening. There's a lot of gray area there. And I just think that, as much as I want to make a statement and say we need to take a position on this, I don't want to ignore the ordinance the edict that she's putting out there as well. So it's just kind of putting us in a bad position, I feel.
And again, if I may, Your Honor, is certainly from an enforcement standpoint, there is an element of discretion that we can use. And so I'm not sure we're going to be ticketing people May 1st if they don't meet the high grass requirement. I think there have to be some reasonable time to allow that to be addressed in light of the governor's executive order.
So I'll just say that if there's no other than something that wouldn't be necessarily in the resolution here, but if not, we'll have to continue to monitor what comes from the governor's office if there's an adjustment or a movement on this relative to the conversation here tonight.
Your Honor.
Yes, Councilman Michelangelo.
Does it make sense procedurally that on the next council agenda, that we just have a resolution publicly stating that the city of Monroe will not be enforcing the high grass ordinance on, through the month of April?
I looked at Mr. Pastu, but it could be as long as the executive order as it stands currently. That language, I know it's what you're referring to.
Yeah,
I think,
that'd be great.
yeah, I think that would be something we can at least, I think there's an opportunity to send another message to the community, those that may be getting the message from this evening, but also again on Monday. And we'll see if it doesn't change, then we should probably make a statement.
If I may, Your Honor, too, is I can work with, Mark and Miss Egan and Patrick, and maybe if we have a position statement that we can read aloud at the council meeting related to that, tying together the governor's executive order as well as our existing ordinance for high grass. So if that would be fine. And then if the council decides to engage in, resolution or motion, that would be fine.
Councilman Lamore, you have your hand up.
I do. I'm just a little concerned that it may be a little too lax for some of the residents and allow them to basically, carte blanche, just do what they want.
Mr. Pastu.
I'm shaking my head. Yes, I agree. And yet at the same time, I think we're governed by the executive order as well as our own ordinance.
No further questions.
All right, thanks, Councilman. And again, I think there'll be additional dialogue to the governor's office, and honestly, there's an email there as well, and people have asked me, well, how do I make that message? I said, well, there is messages being shared in at least dialogue, but everybody has the opportunity to send that as well. I'm not looking to overload anybody's email with regarding the lawn maintenance contracts, but I know they have lobbyists and they have their group that's also from the business side of it that's championing that as well. So the executive order kind of is how it's stated, and I'm not inclined necessarily to get to find latitude that then the next executive order somebody's going to ask as well potentially. So,
Your
okay.
Honor.
Yes, Councilman Michelangelo.
I'd make a motion that we approve COVID-19 resolution number 5.
Second.
It's motion by Councilman Michelangelo, supported by Councilman Felder regarding the COVID-19 resolution number 5. Other comments? Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilperson Germaini,
Yes.
Lamore,
Yes.
Felder,
Yes.
Whitman,
Yes.
Michaelangeli,
Yes.
Vining,
You're muted.
I was trying to unmute her. I should be able to do that, and I can't for some
Yeah.
reason.
There.
There.
Oh, you had it there.
There's a screen, I get kicked out of the call, but yes.
Thank you.
Mayor Clark.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Clerk, next item, please.
I have no further items, Your Honor.
Okay, it's council comments, and it is April. Councilwoman Germaini.
Me. So people that know me know that I always look for the good in everything. So amid this COVID-19 negativity, I see positive things. I see a lot of people outreaching to other people and helping their neighbors a lot more. And there's a lot more religion than there was previously. So I applaud that. That's all. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Lamore.
You've already heard my concerns regarding the mowing. That is obviously a concern. I can only ask our neighbors that are able to do their lawns, please keep them up if they can, because I don't think we need anything deteriorating more than it already has. Stay healthy. Obviously, that's a major concern. Get your rest whenever possible. And I have just one general question regarding the skateboard. Are those still operational or allowed to be used?
I'm sorry.
The skateboard parks are, you know, the one at Munson and the one at over by the Battlefield Museum.
I think we closed a lot of playground equipment to discourage assembly as well as sanitize and so I'll ask Ms. LaPointe tomorrow if those have been closed or not.
All right, there was just a question that was brought up by another constituent.
Yeah. Okay, I'll follow up on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Felder.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just hope everyone's able to stay healthy and safe. That's all I got.
Thank you. Councilwoman Whitman.
Yes, I have been home. I haven't left the place. I've talked to some people. I really don't have a lot to talk about. So I hope everyone stays safe. I did watch what was going on in Lansing today. I thought that was dangerous. People out there without masks and, you know, standing right by each other and taking a chance, not only with their health, but with everyone else's health. So I hope you all stay safe and let's get through this. And eventually maybe we'll be face to face in person. That's all I have.
Thank you. Councilman Michelangeli.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to thank Vince, Ed, and Barry for putting together a well formatted budget for the next fiscal year, and just reiterate to everybody, I hope the community stays well and safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Vining.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. I just want to encourage everyone to be well, stay safe. And I'd also like to say I am very well pleased with the city and the actions that the administration have taken. And not only the administration, but other agencies and businesses located throughout the county. I'm very well pleased when I compare to where I have family members who live outside of the city, and to see the actions that we took very early on. And while it is a little sad to see the numbers here continue to increase, I just really feel like the steps that we took early on before the state, before the county, really made a difference in keeping the numbers as, I don't want to say they're low because any death is bad, but as low as they are in our county. And I want to commend you all, the mayor and the administration, the entire council, and the entire city of Monroe. I'm comparing it to what I'm seeing elsewhere. And I think we've done a good job so far. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I am still praying for our city and all of our residents and businesses. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I just have a couple of comments. I also want to thank the administration and the staff. I mean, and it's been said about putting this budget together. And here we are in our virtual meeting again. Clerk Treasurer Lavoie and her work getting us to be all together here. And of course, Jake Perry, where would we be without IT on these things? You had a challenge. It always pops up a minute or two before. So my appreciation to all, to get the budget and to set to us to be able to get through that and to have it viewed by the public as well is wonderful. So I think about, some people think we're kind of at a standstill, and I don't think we're at a standstill, but some things are just getting moved down the road a little bit. Because it is conflicting at times to move some things forward. But council's not at a standstill. So first I want to say y'all look great. It's great to see everybody. And at the same time, it's clear to me, and it should be, and be thankful to the council, it should be clear to the residents that just because we've had some pauses here and we're not in the regular mode, the topics that are important to the city, if anybody's watching and will watch later, we'll see. It starts with the budget, then about refuge, then about the public safety, then about the parking downtown, our goals and objectives. These are things we've talked about for months and we're still on our mind. And I really appreciate the fact council bringing those items up, knowing that we're engaged in that conversation, even though we're not collectively and collaborating together in the same room. And I think it's a good message to show that, just as Councilwoman Vining said, there's a lot that's being done, even though it may not be done in the fashion that wasn't before. And again, kudos and credit to the staff for that as well. A couple items did come up, and I think just to make time safe for or shorten for everybody, the SEMCOG Economic Impact webinar that was yesterday, and Mr. Pastu referred to as I received it today. I'm just going to ship it out to the council. That way you can have a direct link to it. You don't have to go look for it if it came in an email or didn't. And the other one was the Michigan Municipal League email that came out today regarding some of the opportunity potential of funding coming out of federal regarding a stimulus for local and the state. So I'll just sit those out to everybody either later today or tomorrow. And I think that is my comments. So we already covered yard waste in the executive order. So I think I'll move on. Clerk Treasurer Lavoie.
I just have one thing along the lines of what you were talking about. Business continues to happen. Residents should have received a mailing. For some of them, it was a second mailing of an absentee application. If you've already turned yours in, I've been on the phone with several residents. If you've already turned in your application, and even further, if you have your ballot, then please disregard that additional one that came in from the state. They were originally going to scrub the lists and not mail to those that we had already mailed to, but I just think time was short and they needed to move ahead. And again, that's just the state trying to make sure that, thank you, Councilman Lamore. That was just the state trying to make sure that since we are really, we're just stopping short of making this a compulsory vote by mail election. It isn't compulsory, but it is highly, highly encouraged. They wanted to make sure that those that normally don't vote AV and aren't on our permanent absentee list receive one. So again, if it's a duplicate for you, just throw it away or call us if you're unsure. We are still quarantining mail for a couple of days, but we are turning ballots around and we already have received ballots back. So I know that that's working. So if you have any questions, you can email us at elections@monroemi.gov and or call our office. And I know residents have been able to find me on Facebook as well, and I'm happy to know that. So just keep communicating with us and we'll continue to provide you details about the upcoming election because it will look very different, but that's for another night. Thank you.
Thank you, Clerk Lavoie. Mr. Pastu.
Again, I really want to thank council for providing an opportunity to go through the budget. Again, at the start, I said I was very uncomfortable with everything going on, asking you to adopt a budget. And I do appreciate you taking the time and understanding some of the challenges that we have going forward. I can't tell you how many people I can thank for everything working with our remote meeting and certainly Jake and, Michelle and Matt and Jake and Mark have done a wonderful job and we're actually getting comfortable with it. So again, many thanks. And then also the broader community for the support and understanding that they've provided through this difficult time. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add at all or any update?
No, I don't think anything additionally this evening.
Okay.
Thank you. City Attorney, Mr. Buds.
Just briefly, Honor, it's been a pleasure to work with city administration on working through our COVID response and happy to participate in that. And I think as was discussed, unfortunately, I'll just say difficulties posed for residents, business community, and for the city in dealing with the executive order. And I expect we'll see more of that as we go forward, and we'll keep you apprised of that and discuss as we move through that and hopefully on to better times in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Buds. At this time, the next item is citizens' comments. And I'm definitely going to need help from Mr. Buds, Clerk Treasurer Lavoie, and maybe even Mr. Perry, if it appears there may be a call or a comment coming in. clerk treasurer, or is way to take the first comment?
So yes, but first, let me just say real quick, we have not received any email comments, Your Honor.
Okay, I see there's a few others that have joined. I'm not sure if they're going to speak or not. So I'll let you manage the calls or information coming in.
All right, I will see. Let me unmute Mr. Batdorf if I can. I may need Jake's help.
Your Honor, if I may, I had clicked to allow everyone to be permitted to talk, and if we give just a moment, we should be able to unmute them and see if there's anyone who has any public comment here, and I'm working on that just as we go through this process.
All right, so those that are joining us here that may have comments, please be patient as we figure out the correct way and get it done organized. Don't leave, you have an opportunity to make your comments.
Council, this is Jake. Everybody is able to talk. Those who are using the app need to unmute themselves if they wish to talk. Anybody on the phone is currently unmuted and permitted to talk.
So maybe I'll just try this and say, have a name, please, and then we'll just work through those that may wish to speak.
We don't have any raised hands, Your Honor.
Yeah, I don't see raised hands. I do see a box that was lit up that I think they may wanted to speak, but it did not come through. If they try again, please.
Maybe we should read off their last 3 digits of their phone number there.
Yeah.
All right.
Your Honor, I think the other possibility, if I may, is that it may be that there's just background noise from their phone in the room where they are, but it's the person with a phone number that begins with 248 and ends with 587. If they wish any public comment, now would be the appropriate time.
So I'll ask again, the exchange starting with 248, ending with 587. If you wish to speak, I do hear a child. Maybe the young child has the phone. So we'll see if there's other comments. We can always come back to that. See, there's a few others on here. If there's wish comments, I'll give the opportunity. I don't see any other raised hands or any other comments. Any final comments? So if the person that's has the exchange of 248, there's a raised hand. I'll just say Justin. Justin.
Hey, Mayor. I want to thank you guys for all your guys' work in the city of Monroe.
I think that was Jason. I thank you. I think if there was more, we received your thanks about the city of Monroe. If there's another comment.
That's all.
Thank you, Justin. And I'm going to go back to the one that had some, I'll just say, we're not sure whether attempt or not, but the exchange was 248. The last 3 numbers is 587. Maybe there's a technical difficulty here, but please please call the city hall and we can make sure we get your information to the council, follow from that. So if there's a comment. Any others wish to speak this evening? I see none. At this time, I guess the motion will be appropriate.
Your Honor, I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
Okay, we have 2. Motion by Councilman Michaelangi, supported by Councilman Lamore to adjourn. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilperson Germaini?
Yes.
Yes.
Elder?
Yes.
Whitman?
Yes.
Michaelangi?
Yes.
Vining?
Yes.
Mayor Clark?
Yes, we're adjourned. Thank you all.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Stay safe, everybody.
Good night.
Have a nice evening.